Undercover Billionaire orders coffee. Black Waitress secretly slips him a note that stops him cold. She folded the note twice, her hands trembling as she slid it beneath his coffee saucer. And the moment his eyes met hers, steady and searching, Francis knew she'd just changed both their lives forever. The morning light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across Italian marble floors. But Wilson Chambers barely noticed anymore. He stood at the edge of his penthouse balcony 40 stories above Manhattan. The city spread beneath him like a kingdom he'd conquered but never learned to rule. His phone buzzed incessantly on the breakfast table, 12 missed calls before 7 a.m. His assistant, his lawyer, his publicist. Always someone needing something, never simply needing him. Behind him, the designer furniture sat untouched, perfect and cold. The Rothko on the wall cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. The espresso machine was Italian, top of the line. The silence was American, bottom of the soul. Wilson picked up his phone and silenced it without looking. 42 years old. Net worth somewhere north of $3 billion. He'd stopped counting at 2. And last night, he'd sat across from yet another beautiful woman, whose eyes glazed over with dollar signs the moment she learned his last name. She'd spent their entire dinner at Le Bernardin taking selfies, angling for the perfect shot with him in the background, her trophy for the evening. When she'd leaned in for a kiss, he'd tasted ambition on her lips, and it made him want to disappear. "Caroline," he whispered to the empty room, his voice cracking on the name he rarely spoke aloud anymore. 3 years since the cancer took her. 3 years of this hollow existence. She'd married him when he was nobody, a hungry entrepreneur with more ideas than capital, sleeping on friends' couches and eating ramen. She'd believed in him before the first million, before the Forbes list, before the world decided he was worth knowing. Now everyone wanted to know Wilson Chambers the billionaire. No one wanted to know Wilson the man who still dreamed about his wife's laugh, who ate cereal standing over the sink at midnight, who was so desperately lonely he could barely breathe. He looked at his reflection in the window, expensive haircut, personal trainer physique, custom suit. A stranger in his own skin. When had he become this person? When had his life become a performance he could no longer stop? Wilson made a decision. He walked to his bedroom, pulled out the back of his closet, and found what he was looking for: a worn flannel shirt, faded jeans with a frayed hem, an old canvas jacket Caroline had bought him at a thrift store as a joke. "In case you forget where you came from," she'd said, kissing his cheek. He dressed like he was shedding a shell. No watch. No designer anything. He looked in the mirror and saw something closer to who he used to be. Maybe, just maybe, if he walked out into the world like this, someone might see him. Really see him. Not the money. Not the power. Just Wilson. Across the East River in Queens, Frances Mitchell's alarm clock screamed at 4:47 a.m., and she wanted to throw it across her shoebox apartment. Instead, she slapped it silent and forced her body upright, every muscle protesting. 36 years old, and she felt 60. That's what 3 jobs did to you. Wore you down to the bone until there was nothing left but the motion of survival. The apartment was dark, cold. She couldn't afford to run the heat overnight. Frances grabbed the blanket from her bed, threadbare, but hers, and wrapped it around her shoulders as she shuffled to the bathroom. The mirror showed a face she barely recognized anymore. Deep circles under her eyes, her natural hair pulled back tight because she didn't have time for anything else, lips pressed thin from years of biting back words she wanted to say. She'd been beautiful once. At least, her mama used to tell her so. "Frances, baby, you've got a light in you," her mother would say, touching her cheek with work-roughened hands. "Don't let this world snuff it out." But the world had other plans. Student loans for a degree she never finished when Mama got sick. Medical bills that swallowed everything. Mama's funeral costs. The endless, grinding weight of not enough. Not enough money, not enough time, not enough anything. Frances worked the overnight shift at a convenience store, the early morning shift at Rosie's Diner, and 3 evenings a week cleaning offices downtown. She existed in a fog of exhaustion, moving through spaces where she was always present but never seen. Invisible. That's what she'd become. The waitress who refilled your coffee. The clerk who rang up your milk. The woman who emptied your trash. She wore the uniform, spoke the required pleasantries, and disappeared the moment you looked away. Frances pulled on her Rosie's Diner outfit. White button-down shirt she'd ironed last night, black slacks that were getting shiny at the knees, non-slip shoes that pinched her toes. She looked at herself one more time and practiced the smile. Bright. Empty. The one that said I'm here to serve you while revealing nothing of the woman underneath. Just another day, she told her reflection. Just keep moving. She grabbed her purse, counted the cash inside, $37 until next week, and headed out into the pre-dawn darkness. The subway station smelled like urine and desperation. She stood on the platform among the other early morning workers, all of them wearing the same exhaustion like a second skin. They were the invisible army that kept the city running, cleaning, serving, stocking, caring. And nobody saw them. Nobody thanked them. Nobody wondered about their dreams. The train lurched into motion, and Frances closed her eyes. She let herself have 1 minute, just 60 seconds, to imagine a different life. One where she didn't count pennies. One where she could sleep until her body decided to wake. One where someone looked at her and saw not a waitress, not a utility, but Frances. A woman with thoughts and feelings and worth. The train screeched to her stop. The minute was over. She climbed the stairs to street level and walked the 4 blocks to Rosie's Diner, an institution in this corner of Queens since 1952. The neon sign buzzed and flickered. The S had been out for 2 months. Rosie herself had died a decade ago, but her nephew Eddie kept the place running on nostalgia and stubbornness. Frances pushed through the door at 5:28 a.m. Eddie was already behind the counter, setting up the coffee station. Morning, Frances. Morning, Eddie. The same exchange every day. Comfortable. Predictable. Safe. She tied her apron, checked her notepad and pen, and began the opening routine she could perform in her sleep. Fill the sugar dispensers. Check the salt and pepper shakers. Wipe down the vinyl booths. The diner would open at 6, and the morning rush would hit by 6:30. Construction workers, taxi drivers, nurses ending overnight shifts. They'd order coffee and eggs, leave decent tips, and never look her in the eye. That was fine. Frances had stopped expecting anything else. She glanced at the clock. 5:54 a.m. 6 minutes until showtime. 6 minutes until she put on the smile and disappeared into the role. She took a breath, steadied herself, and felt the familiar resignation settle over her shoulders like a weight. Just another day. But across the city, Wilson Chambers was stepping out of his building in clothes that didn't cost more than a car payment, hailing a regular taxi instead of his driver, and feeling his heart beat with something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Dangerous, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, today would be different. Their paths were about to collide in a corner booth at Rosie's Diner, over a cup of black coffee and a note that would shatter both their worlds. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life, like nobody saw the real you? Drop a comment and share your story. I'd love to hear it. Wilson's taxi pulled up to Rosie's Diner at 6:47 a.m., and he sat for a moment, staring at the faded exterior. Paint peeling near the doorframe. The flickering neon sign that announced Row IEs to the world. Through the smudged window, he could see the morning crowd, real people living real lives, none of them performing for cameras or board meetings. He paid the driver with cash, actual bills from his wallet, not a black card that made everything feel transactional, and stepped onto the sidewalk. The autumn air bit at his skin through the thin jacket. When was the last time he'd been cold? Actually cold, not just moving from heated car to heated building? He couldn't remember. The diner door chimed as he entered, a cheerful sound that seemed at odds with the tired faces hunched over coffee cups. Wilson scanned the room. Every booth and counter stool was occupied except for one spot in the far corner. A booth with a view of both the front entrance and what looked like the kitchen and back. Perfect. He slid into the vinyl seat, the material cracking under his weight, and immediately felt out of place despite his disguise. Everyone here belonged. They had the rhythm of regulars, the muscle memory of people who knew exactly what they'd order before sitting down. Wilson picked up the laminated menu with its grease-stained edges and tried to look natural. That's when he saw her. She moved through the narrow space between tables with an economy of motion that spoke of years doing this exact dance. Black woman, late 30s maybe, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, her white shirt crisp despite the chaos around her. She was pouring coffee for a table of construction workers, her smile bright and automatic, but Wilson noticed something the others didn't. Her eyes were elsewhere. Distant, like she was watching her own life from somewhere far away. She glanced up, and for a split second their eyes met. Wilson felt something shift in his chest, a recognition he couldn't name. She looked away quickly, finishing with the construction workers before grabbing a coffee pot and heading in his direction. "Morning," she said, her voice pleasant but practiced. Professional. She didn't quite meet his eyes as she placed a paper napkin and silverware in front of him. "Coffee, please." "Black." She poured, and Wilson watched her hands. They were steady, efficient, but he noticed the slight tremor when she set the pot down. Exhaustion, maybe. Or something else. "You know what you want, or do you need a minute?" she asked, pulling out her order pad. "Just the coffee's fine for now." She nodded, already turning away, but then she froze. Her body went rigid, and Wilson saw her eyes dart toward the counter. He followed her gaze. Two men sat on stools near the register, both in their 30s, dressed too carefully casual for the working-class crowd. One wore designer sneakers that cost at least $400. Wilson knew because he owned the same pair. The other had a professional camera bag at his feet, trying and failing to look inconspicuous. And they were both staring directly at Wilson. The one with the camera leaned toward his companion, whispering something. Then he casually lifted his phone and angled it toward Wilson's booth. Not obvious, but not subtle either. Wilson's stomach dropped. He'd been so careful. Changed clothes, took a taxi, chose a random diner in Queens. How had they found him? Then he realized they hadn't found him. They'd been following him, probably since he left his building. And now they had him cornered in a public place, ready to splash "Billionaire slums it in Queens diner" across whatever tabloid would pay most. The waitress, he noticed her name tag said Frances, had seen it too. She stood frozen beside his booth, her eyes moving between Wilson and the two men, her mind clearly working through something. Wilson watched her face change, saw the moment she made a decision. She stepped closer to his table, blocking the camera's angle with her body. Her hand trembled as she pulled her order pad closer, and she began writing, her pen moving quickly. Wilson's heart hammered. What was she doing? Frances tore the page from her pad, folded it once, then twice, her movements deliberate despite the shaking in her fingers. She placed his coffee cup back on its saucer, and as she did, she slipped the folded note underneath, her eyes finally meeting his. The world stopped. In that moment, that suspended, crystalline moment, Wilson saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen in 3 years. Real human concern. Not calculation. Not ambition. Just a woman looking at another human being and choosing to help. She didn't smile. Didn't speak. Just held his gaze for 3 seconds that felt like an eternity, and in those seconds he understood. Read this. Now. Then she walked away, her pace measured, nothing in her body language suggesting anything unusual had just happened. Wilson watched her disappear into the kitchen area, his pulse thundering in his ears. He glanced at the two men at the counter. They were watching him, waiting. One had his phone out, probably recording. The other was typing rapidly, sending updates to an editor, maybe, or coordinating with photographers outside. Wilson lifted his coffee cup with a steady hand he didn't feel and took a sip. Then, as casually as if checking for sugar, he lifted the saucer. The note was small, folded tight. He palmed it, set down the saucer, and opened it beneath the table where the cameras couldn't see. Her handwriting was rushed but clear. The two men at the counter. They know who you are. Back exit through the kitchen. Now. Wilson's breath caught. He read it again, his mind racing. She'd seen them. Understood the danger. And she was trying to save him. But why? She didn't know him. Didn't know him anything. He was just another customer in her endless rotation of people who took up space and left tips. Except she'd looked at him. Really looked, and seen something worth protecting. Wilson folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. His hands were steady now, his mind clear. He'd built an empire on reading situations and making split-second decisions. This was no different. He took another sip of coffee, slow and unconcerned. Then he stood, leaving a $20 bill on the table, far more than the coffee cost, and walked toward the restroom sign at the back of the diner. The two men watched him go but didn't follow. They probably assumed he'd come back to his booth. Why wouldn't he? As far as they knew, he had no idea he'd been made. Wilson pushed through the restroom door, but instead of going inside, he slipped past it into the narrow hallway that led to the kitchen. The sounds of sizzling food and clattering dishes grew louder. He could smell bacon grease and burned toast. Frances was there, standing by the emergency exit door, her arms crossed over her chest like she was trying to hold herself together. When she saw him, her eyes widened. "You shouldn't," she started, but Wilson cut her off. "Thank you," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "I don't know how you knew, but thank you." She shook her head quickly. Just go. Before they realize. How did you? They're shoes, she said quietly, urgently. Designer sneakers. Camera bag. They don't belong here. And the way they were watching you. She paused, her eyes searching his face. You're trying not to be seen. I understand that. Something in her voice, the weight of those last 4 words, hit Wilson like a punch to the chest. I understand that. She wasn't just talking about him. I can't just leave, Wilson said. They'll harass you for helping me. I'm invisible, Frances said, and there was something broken in her voice that made Wilson's heart crack. They don't see people like me. I'll be fine. She reached for the door handle, but Wilson's hand covered hers before she could turn it. The contact froze them both, her skin warm against his, the moment suddenly charged with something neither of them had expected. What's your name? Wilson asked quietly. Frances. Wilson. Her eyes widened slightly. So she knew who he was. Of course she did. Everyone did. Thank you, Frances, he said again. I won't forget this. She pulled her hand from under his, and he saw her walls slam back up. It's nothing. Just go. But it wasn't nothing. They both knew it. Something had passed between them in that moment when she slipped him the note. Something real and true and terrifying. Wilson pushed open the emergency exit door. The morning air rushed in, cold and sharp. An alley stretched before him, dumpsters and fire escapes creating shadows. Freedom. He stepped through, then turned back one more time. Frances stood in the doorway, backlit by the harsh kitchen fluorescence, her silhouette both strong and fragile. Her expression was unreadable, but her hands were clasped tight in front of her, knuckles white. I'll come back, Wilson said. Don't, she replied, but her voice wavered. People like you don't come back to places like this. People like me, Wilson repeated, tasting the bitterness of it. You don't know me. I know enough, Frances said. I know you don't belong in Queens. I know those men will write some article about you, and you'll go back to your real life. And this will be a story you tell at cocktail parties. Wilson wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but the door was already closing. Frances had made her choice. Help him and walk away. Clean. Simple. No complications. The door clicked shut, and Wilson was alone in the alley. He stood there for a moment, the note still burning in his pocket, her words echoing in his mind. I'm invisible. The pain in that statement. The resignation. Wilson pulled out his phone, 15 missed calls now, and finally acknowledged the world he'd been trying to escape. His assistant answered on the first ring. Mr. Chambers, where are you? There are photographers outside your building, and we're getting calls from. I'm fine, Wilson interrupted. I'll be back in an hour. Prepare a statement. I was exploring the city. That's all. No comment beyond that. Sir, there are rumors about a woman. No comment, Wilson repeated firmly. And find out which tabloid sent those photographers. I want to know by tonight. He hung up and looked back at the closed emergency exit door. Behind it, Frances was probably already back on the floor, pouring coffee, smiling her practiced smile, disappearing into the background of other people's lives. But Wilson had seen her. Really seen her. And he couldn't shake the feeling that she'd seen him too. Seen past the clothes and the disguise, straight through to the lonely man underneath. Wilson walked to the end of the alley and hailed a taxi back to Manhattan. But he couldn't stop thinking about Frances. The tremor in her hands. The way she'd stood in that doorway like she was holding the weight of the world on her shoulders. The quiet devastation in those 2 words. I'm invisible. She'd saved him. A stranger. For nothing in return. And Wilson Chambers, who'd spent 3 years surrounded by people who only saw his money, couldn't remember the last time someone had done something for him without expecting anything back. He pulled the note from his pocket and unfolded it again, staring at her handwriting. Direct. Clear. Brave. I'll come back, he'd promised. And for the first time in 3 years, Wilson felt something other than emptiness. He felt purpose. Frances's hands wouldn't stop shaking. She stood at the coffee station, refilling the pot for the 3rd time in 20 minutes, and her fingers trembled so badly she nearly dropped it. Around her, the diner hummed with its usual morning chaos. Orders shouted, plates clattering, customers laughing and complaining in equal measure. But Frances felt like she was watching it all from underwater, everything muffled and distant. What had she done? The 2 men at the counter had left 10 minutes after Wilson disappeared through the back. They'd thrown some bills down, looking frustrated and confused, scanning the diner one more time before heading out. Frances had kept her head down, kept moving, pretending she hadn't noticed anything unusual. But Eddie noticed. Eddie always noticed. "Francis," he called from behind the grill, his voice carrying that edge of concern that made her stomach clench. "Come here a minute." She set down the coffee pot and walked over, her practiced smile firmly in place. "What's up?" Eddie wiped his hands on his apron, his weathered face creased with worry. He was 63, had been running this place since his uncle died, and treated his employees like family, which meant he worried too much and paid too little, but his heart was good. "Those two guys who just left," Eddie said quietly, glancing toward the door. "They were asking questions. About the man in the corner booth. About you." Francis's blood ran cold. "What kind of questions?" "What you said to him. If you knew him. If he comes here regular." Eddie's eyes searched her face. "Francis, what's going on? Who was that guy?" "Just a customer," Francis said, but her voice sounded thin even to her own ears. "Don't lie to me, girl. I've known you 7 years. You helped him, didn't you? I saw you talking by the back door." Francis's throat tightened. She wanted to deny it, to brush it off, but Eddie's eyes were too kind. Too knowing. "He needed help," she said finally. "Those men were following him. Taking pictures. He just wanted to be left alone." Eddie sighed long and heavy. "Francis, baby, you can't get involved in other people's problems. Especially not rich people's problems. How did you?" "Those shoes he was wearing might have been old, but they were Brunello Cucinelli. I know because my daughter bought my son-in-law a pair for their anniversary. Cost her $800. Eddie shook his head. "That man was pretending to be something he's not. And now those reporters are going to come back, and they're going to want to talk to you." "I didn't do anything wrong," Francis said, but even as the words left her mouth, she felt the weight of what she'd actually done settling over her shoulders. She'd inserted herself into a world she didn't understand. A world that would chew her up and spit her out without a second thought. "I know you didn't," Eddie said gently. "But wrong don't matter when people want a story. You just be careful, okay? Don't talk to any reporters if they come around. And maybe," he hesitated, "maybe that guy shouldn't come back here. For your sake." Francis nodded, but something twisted in her chest at those words. That guy shouldn't come back here. Why did that hurt? She didn't even know him. Wilson. That was his name. Just Wilson. Not a customer number or a booth assignment. A person with a name who'd looked at her like she mattered. But Eddie was right. Men like Wilson, wealthy, powerful, living in a different universe, they didn't come back to places like Rosie's. They didn't come back to women like Francis. She'd been a convenience, a momentary help. By tomorrow, he'd forget her face. And that was fine. That was how it was supposed to be. So why did her chest ache like something had been torn away? "Table 6 needs a refill," Eddie said, breaking the moment. "And booth 3 has been waiting on their check." Francis grabbed the coffee pot and went back to work, disappearing into the rhythm of pour, smile, clear, repeat. But she couldn't stop replaying those 3 seconds when their eyes met. The way Wilson had looked at her, not through her, not past her, but at her. Like he actually saw Frances Mitchell, the woman, not just the uniform. Her pocket felt heavy with the $20 bill he'd left. She'd picked it up from his table after he'd gone, and now it sat folded in her apron like evidence of something she couldn't name. The morning shift crawled by. Noon came and went. Frances moved on autopilot, her body performing tasks while her mind spun in circles. She kept glancing at the door, half expecting Wilson to walk back in, and hating herself for expecting it. Finally, at 2 p.m., her shift ended. Frances changed out of her work clothes in the tiny bathroom, pulling on jeans and a sweater, and stepped out into the autumn afternoon. The air was crisp, the sky that particular shade of blue that made everything feel both beautiful and melancholy. She walked toward the subway, exhausted down to her bones, when a voice stopped her cold. "Excuse me. Frances Mitchell?" Frances turned. A woman stood on the sidewalk, mid-30s, professionally dressed, holding a voice recorder. Behind her, a man with a camera. "Reporters." Frances's heart kicked into overdrive. "I don't have anything to say. Just a few questions," the woman said, stepping closer with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "About Wilson Chambers. We understand you helped him this morning at Rosie's diner. I don't know what you're talking about. We have witnesses who saw you speaking with him near the kitchen. Did Mr. Chambers ask you to help him evade photographers?" "I served him coffee," Frances said flatly. "That's my job. Now please leave me alone." She turned to walk away, but the woman followed. "Did he pay you? Is that how this works?" He pays service workers to help him with his undercover stunts. Frances spun around, anger flaring hot and sudden in her chest. He didn't pay me for anything except coffee. I don't know him. I've never seen him before today. And I'd appreciate it if you'd stop harassing me at my workplace. The cameraman was filming now, and Frances felt the violation of it. Her exhausted face, her worn-out clothes, her frustration captured for entertainment. So you're saying this was just good Samaritan behavior? The reporter pressed. You just happened to notice two journalists and decided to help a billionaire escape? I noticed two people making someone uncomfortable, Frances said, her voice shaking with rage now. And yes, I helped, because that's what decent people do. Now get that camera out of my face before I call the police. She walked away quickly, her heart pounding, and didn't look back even when the reporter called after her. Frances descended into the subway station, her hands trembling again, and leaned against the tiled wall. This was bad. Really bad. She'd seen the camera. That footage would end up somewhere, online, on TV, wherever these vultures sold their stories. And tomorrow, her face would be attached to Wilson Chambers's name. Eddie's words echoed in her mind. You can't get involved in other people's problems. Especially not rich people's problems. Too late now. Frances rode the subway in a daze, got off at her stop, and climbed the stairs to street level. Her phone buzzed, a text from her friend Shanice, who worked the overnight shift at the convenience store with her. Girl, turn on Channel 7. Now. Frances's stomach dropped. She pulled out her phone and opened the news app. The headline hit her like a fist. Mystery woman helps billionaire Wilson Chambers escape tabloid photographers. Who is she? Below it, a grainy photo taken from across the street. Frances standing in the doorway of Rosie's diner, Wilson in front of her, their hands touching on the door handle. It looked intimate, conspiratorial, like they knew each other, like they'd planned it. Frances clicked the article with shaking fingers. Wilson Chambers, billionaire CEO of Chambers Global Industries, was spotted this morning at Rosie's diner in Queens, apparently attempting to go incognito. But when photographers arrived, an unnamed waitress reportedly helped Chambers escape through the back exit. Sources say the two appeared to be in conversation for several minutes. Is this a new relationship? A paid arrangement? Or simply a kind stranger helping someone in need? Chambers' representatives declined to comment. We're working to identify the mystery woman. Frances felt sick. Mystery woman. Like she was a character in someone else's story. Like her whole life could be reduced to a caption under a photograph. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She let it go to voicemail. It rang again immediately. Another unknown number. The reporters had her name now. It was only a matter of time before they had everything else. Her address, her other jobs, her whole pathetic struggle of a life laid bare for entertainment. Frances turned off her phone and walked the last 2 blocks to her apartment building. Her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. She climbed the 3 flights to her floor, unlocked her door, and finally, blessedly, closed herself inside. The apartment was silent. Cold. Empty. Frances slid down the door until she was sitting on the floor, her back against the wood, and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd done. She'd tried to help someone. That was all. A simple, human act of kindness. And now her life was about to be turned inside out. She pulled the $20 bill from her pocket and stared at it. $20. Not even enough to cover one of her monthly bills. But Wilson had left it like it was nothing, because to him, it was nothing. That was the difference between their worlds. He could walk away from this. Return to his penthouse, his empire, his insulated life. He'd done it before. The article mentioned he was widowed, that his late wife Caroline had been his only authentic relationship. So he knew how to protect himself. How to disappear back into wealth and privilege when reality got too messy. But Frances? She couldn't disappear. She lived in the real world, where reporters camped outside diners and $20 mattered, and one moment of kindness could upend everything. I'll come back, Wilson had said. But he wouldn't. Frances knew that now. Men like him didn't come back to women like her. This morning had been a story he'd tell someday, laughing over expensive wine at some gala. Remember that time I went undercover in Queens and a waitress helped me escape the tabloids? What was her name? Frances? Francine. He wouldn't remember. People never remembered the invisible ones. Frances folded the $20 bill and tucked it back in her pocket. Then she pulled herself up off the floor, walked to her bedroom, and did what she always did when life got overwhelming. She set her alarm for 10 p.m. and tried to sleep before her overnight shift. Because bills didn't stop coming just because your world fell apart. And invisibility was supposed to be protection, not a curse. Except now Frances couldn't shake the feeling that for 3 seconds this morning, she'd been seen. And God help her, she wanted to be seen again. Even if it destroyed her. Across the river in Manhattan, Wilson sat in his penthouse living room, his lawyer and publicist firing questions at him while his assistant fielded calls in the background. The news had exploded within hours, every tabloid, gossip site, and news outlet running some version of the story. But Wilson wasn't listening to the crisis management strategy they were developing. He was staring at his phone, at the article with Frances's photo. They'd found her, put her face online, turned her into a spectacle. And it was his fault. "Mr. Chambers, are you listening?" his publicist, Veronica, asked sharply. "We need to release a statement tonight. Something that shuts this down before it spirals further." "What kind of statement?" Wilson asked quietly. "Simple. You were exploring the city. The waitress was helpful. There's no relationship, no story. We emphasize your privacy, mention your late wife, make it clear you're not interested in dating or drama." "Done." Wilson's jaw tightened. "You want me to throw her under the bus?" "We want to protect you both," Veronica countered. "The longer this story has legs, the worse it gets for everyone. Right now, she's mystery woman. By tomorrow, they'll have her full name, her address, her employment history. Do you want that?" "Of course not." "Then we shut it down. We make you the story, not her. We control the narrative." Wilson stood and walked to the window. The city glittered below him, thousands of lights representing thousands of lives he'd never know. Somewhere out there, in a small apartment in Queens, Frances was probably watching this unfold. Probably terrified. Because of him. He'd promised to come back. But now, coming back would only make things worse. Every moment he spent near Frances would feed the media machine. They'd dissect her life, manufacture a relationship, turn something real and human into entertainment. The responsible thing, the kind thing, was to stay away. Let her fade back into invisibility where she'd be safe. "Fine," Wilson said, his voice hollow. "Draft the statement. I'll approve it within the hour." Veronica nodded, satisfied. "Good. This'll blow over in 48 hours. Trust me." But as his team filed out of the room, already working their phones and tablets, Wilson pulled the folded note from his pocket. Frances's handwriting. Her words. "The 2 men at the counter. They know who you are. Back exit through the kitchen." Now. She'd seen the danger. Acted without hesitation. Asked for nothing in return. And now he was about to do exactly what she'd predicted. Go back to his real life and let her become a footnote. A story. Wilson crumpled the note in his fist. "I'm invisible," she'd said. And he was about to make sure she stayed that way. For her own good. Even if it meant breaking the first real promise he'd made in 3 years. Frances woke to the sound of voices outside her apartment door. For a confused moment, she thought she'd overslept, that somehow her alarm hadn't gone off and she was late for her overnight shift. But then she registered the voices. Multiple people talking over each other, the shuffle of feet, the distinct whir and click of camera shutters. Her heart stopped. Frances grabbed her phone from the nightstand. 3:47 p.m. She'd been asleep less than 4 hours. And she had 43 missed calls, 67 text messages, and her voicemail was full. The voices outside got louder. Someone knocked, harsh, insistent. "Ms. Mitchell? Frances Mitchell? We just want to ask you a few questions about Wilson Chambers." Frances sat frozen in her bed, her pulse thundering in her ears. They'd found her address. They were outside her door. How many of them? 3, 5, 10. Another voice, different reporter. "Frances, we're prepared to compensate you for an exclusive interview. Very generously." She pulled her blanket up to her chin like a child hiding from monsters. Except these monsters had cameras and bylines and the power to turn her entire life into a headline. Her phone buzzed. A text from Eddie. Reporters showed up at the diner. Had to close early. "I'm sorry, Frances. Take a few days off. Paid. Just lay low." Then Shanice. "Girl, where are you? Your building is on the news. There's like 20 reporters outside. Call me." Then a number she didn't recognize. "Ms. Mitchell, this is Veronica Chun from Chambers Global Industries. Mr. Chambers would like to speak with you regarding the media situation. Please call me at your earliest convenience." Frances stared at that last message, her mind reeling. Wilson's people. They wanted to speak with her. which probably meant they wanted to pay her to disappear, to sign some non-disclosure agreement, to pretend this morning never happened. The knocking came again, louder. "Ms. Mitchell, we know you're in there. We just want your side of the story." Frances looked around her tiny apartment. The peeling paint, the radiator that clanked, the window that didn't quite close all the way. This was her sanctuary. Her one place in the world where she could let down the mask and just be. And now it was under siege. She couldn't stay here. But she couldn't leave either. They'd photograph her, follow her, turn her commute into a spectacle. She was trapped. Frances pulled on clothes with shaking hands and tried to think. She needed help. Real help. Not from Wilson's corporate handlers, but from someone who understood what it meant to have your privacy stripped away by people who saw you as content, not human. Her phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her press accept. "Frances Mitchell?" A man's voice. Familiar but unexpected. "Who is this?" "It's Wilson. Wilson Chambers. Please don't hang up." Frances's breath caught. She walked to her window and looked down at the street. News vans. Reporters with cameras. A crowd forming to see what the fuss was about. Her building, her home, turned into a circus. "Is this real?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Or is this your publicist calling to offer me money to shut up?" "It's really me," Wilson said quietly. "And I'm so sorry. This is my fault. All of it." "Yes," Frances said, anger and fear and exhaustion mixing into something bitter in her throat. "It is your fault. You brought your world to my doorstep, and now I can't even leave my own apartment without being ambushed." "I know. I'm sorry. My team released a statement an hour ago, said there was no story, that you were just a helpful stranger. We thought it would make them leave you alone." Frances laughed, harsh and hollow. "Well, it didn't work. There are reporters camped outside my building. My boss had to close the diner. My phone won't stop ringing. So thank you for the statement, Mr. Chambers, but your world doesn't work the way you think it does." Silence on the other end. "Then, you're right. I was naive to think a statement would fix this. They smell a story, and they won't let go until they squeeze every drop from it." He paused. "Frances, I want to help. Really help. Not with money or lawyers or corporate spin. I want to get you out of there." "Out of where?" "My home. Out of the situation I put you in," Wilson said. "You can't stay in that apartment with reporters outside. You can't go to work. They'll follow you. You need a place to lay low until this blows over. A few days, maybe a week. And where exactly am I supposed to go?" "A hotel." Frances laughed bitterly. "I can't afford." "I have a place," Wilson interrupted. "Not my penthouse. Somewhere quiet. Private. No one will find you there. You can rest, think, figure out your next move without cameras in your face." Frances closed her eyes. Every instinct screamed danger. She didn't know this man. Didn't know him anything. Going anywhere with him was foolish at best, dangerous at worst. But what was her alternative? Stay trapped in her apartment? Miss work and lose her income? Face the reporters eventually and have every moment captured and dissected? "Why?" Frances asked quietly. "Why do you care what happens to me?" Wilson was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was raw. "Because you helped me when you had no reason to. Because I watched you stand in that doorway looking like you were carrying the weight of the world, and you still chose kindness. And because..." He trailed off. "Because what?" "Because I know what it's like to be invisible in plain sight," Wilson said. "To have everyone see a version of you that isn't real. And for 3 seconds this morning, you saw me. Actually saw me. I can't just walk away and let them destroy you for that." Frances felt tears sting her eyes. She was so tired. So desperately tired. And the thought of being somewhere quiet, somewhere safe, even just for a day. "This is insane," she whispered. "I know. I don't know you. I know that too. If I do this," Frances said, "I'm not going to disappear into your world, Wilson. I'm not going to become your charity case or your project or whatever rich people call it when they help someone from the real world. I'm not asking you to disappear," Wilson said. "I'm asking you to let me fix the mess I created. That's all." Frances looked down at the street again. A reporter was interviewing her neighbor, Mrs. Chen from 2B, who was gesturing animatedly. By tonight, they'd have quotes from everyone in her building. They'd piece together her life. The 3 jobs, the late rent payments, every moment of struggle that Frances had worked so hard to keep private. "How?" she asked. "How do I even get out of here without them following?" "I'm working on that," Wilson said. Give me 20 minutes. Pack a bag, enough for a week. Comfortable clothes, whatever you need. And Francis? Yeah. Thank you, Wilson said. For trusting me. Even a little bit. He hung up before she could tell him she didn't trust him at all. 18 minutes later, Francis stood by her door with a duffel bag packed, her heart hammering so hard she felt lightheaded. She'd thrown in clothes, toiletries, her chargers, the book she'd been trying to read for 3 months. She'd texted Shanice where she was going, or at least, that she was going somewhere safe. She'd called Eddie and told him she'd be back as soon as this died down. And now she waited, feeling like she was about to jump off a cliff. Her phone buzzed. Wilson, building superintendent, is coming to your door. His name is Ray. He's going to take you down through the service entrance in the basement. There's a car waiting in the alley. Gray sedan. Driver's name is Thomas. He'll bring you to me. Francis read the message 3 times. Wilson had arranged all this in less than 20 minutes. Made calls, coordinated logistics, deployed resources like moving chess pieces. This was his world. A world where problems got solved with phone calls and money and access. A knock. Different from the reporter's aggressive pounding. Gentle. 3 taps. Ms. Mitchell? A voice she recognized. Ray, the super who fixed her radiator last winter. It's Ray. Mr. Chambers asked me to help you out. Francis opened the door a crack, keeping the chain lock engaged. Ray stood there looking uncomfortable, his maintenance uniform neat, his expression apologetic. They got to you too? Francis asked. Mr. Chambers called the building owner directly, Ray said. Explained the situation. Asked for help getting you out quietly. The owner said yes. Apparently they do business together. He shrugged. Pays to know people, I guess. Francis unchained the lock and stepped into the hallway. The reporters' voices echoed from the stairwell. They were still camped at the front entrance, but none had made it past the locked lobby door yet. This way, Ray said, leading her toward the back of the building. Service elevator goes straight to the basement. There's an exit that leads to the alley between buildings. Your ride's waiting there. They moved quickly and quietly. Francis felt like a fugitive, sneaking out of her own home. The service elevator was small, cramped, smelling of industrial cleaner. Ray pressed B, and the ancient mechanism groaned to life. Ray, Francis said as they descended. Did Wilson pay you for this? Ray shook his head. Didn't offer. Just asked if I'd help a lady in trouble. Said he'd be grateful. He glanced at her. You okay, Ms. Mitchell? You safe with this guy? Francis realized she didn't know how to answer that. I think so. You got people you can call if you're not? She nodded. Yeah, I do. Good. The elevator lurched to a stop. Because this whole thing feels like a movie, and sometimes movies go bad. Ray led her through the basement, past storage units and the boiler room, to a heavy metal door marked exit. He pushed it open and cool air rushed in. The alley was narrow, shadowed by the buildings on either side. And there, engine running, sat a gray sedan. A man got out, mid-50s professional, wearing a driver's uniform. Ms. Mitchell? I'm Thomas. Mr. Chambers sent me. Francis turned to Ray. Thank you. You be careful, Ray said. Then he went back inside, and Francis was alone in the alley with a stranger and a decision that couldn't be unmade. Thomas opened the back door of the sedan. It's about a 30-minute drive. Mr. Chambers is waiting. Francis looked back at her building one more time. Somewhere above, reporters were still knocking on her door, still waiting for her to emerge. They'd figure out eventually that she'd slipped away. They'd spin it into another story. Mystery woman disappears after helping billionaire. She got into the car. Thomas pulled out of the alley, navigating through Queens with the ease of someone who'd driven these streets 1,000 times. Francis watched her neighborhood disappear through the window. The bodega where she bought coffee, the laundromat where she washed clothes, the subway station she used every day. Her life, being left behind. Where are we going? Francis asked. Brooklyn, Thomas said. Mr. Chambers has a property there. Quiet neighborhood. Private. You'll be comfortable. They drove in silence. Francis watched the city change as they crossed the bridge, Queens to Brooklyn, working class to something else entirely. The buildings got nicer. The streets got cleaner. The people walking past looked less tired. Finally, Thomas turned onto a tree-lined street in Brooklyn Heights. Beautiful brownstones, well-maintained, the kind of neighborhood where Francis would never belong. He pulled up in front of one, red brick, black door, window boxes with flowers. This is it, Thomas said. Mr. Chambers is inside. Frances stared at the brownstone. It was beautiful, tasteful, probably worth several $1,000,000. And Wilson wanted her to stay here. In his world. His space. This was a mistake. She should tell Thomas to take her back. Face the reporters. Deal with this on her own terms. But before she could speak, the black door opened. Wilson stood in the doorway, wearing jeans and a simple gray sweater. No suit. No performance. Just a man who looked as uncertain as she felt. Their eyes met, and Frances felt that same jolt she'd experienced in the diner. The recognition of seeing and being seen. Thomas opened her door. Frances grabbed her duffel bag and got out slowly, her legs unsteady. Wilson walked down the steps to meet her. "You came." "I didn't have much choice," Frances said, but there was no venom in it. Just exhaustion. "I know. And I'm sorry it came to that." Wilson glanced at Thomas. "Thank you, Thomas. I'll call if we need anything." Thomas nodded and drove away, leaving them standing on the sidewalk in the golden afternoon light. "This is your place?" Frances asked, looking up at the brownstone. "It was Caroline's," Wilson said quietly. "My wife. She bought it before we got married. Said she wanted a home, not just a residence. After she died, I couldn't sell it, but I couldn't live here either. So it's just been sitting empty." Frances heard the pain in his voice. The loss. She understood that kind of grief, the kind that turns places into shrines you can't enter but can't leave behind. "You don't have to stay," Wilson said quickly. "If this feels wrong or unsafe or just too weird, Thomas can take you anywhere you want. Hotel, friend's place, another borough. Just say the word." Frances looked at him, really looked. He was nervous. Actually nervous. His hands were shoved in his pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched, like he was trying to make himself smaller. Less intimidating. Here was Wilson Chambers, billionaire, one of the most powerful men in the city. And he was nervous around her. "Show me inside," Frances said. Wilson's shoulders relaxed slightly. He led her up the steps and through the black door into a foyer that took her breath away. Hardwood floors, original crown molding, a staircase with a carved banister. But it wasn't ostentatious. It was warm. Lived in, or at least it had been once. "Caroline decorated everything," Wilson said, watching Frances take it in. "She had this gift for making spaces feel like home. I haven't changed anything." Frances could see it. The touches that spoke of a woman who'd loved beauty but also comfort. Throw blankets draped over the couch. Books on shelves, their spines cracked from reading. Framed photos of Wilson and a beautiful woman with kind eyes, laughing in various locations around the world. Caroline. The woman who'd married Wilson before the money. The woman who'd seen him. "She was beautiful," Frances said softly. "She was everything," Wilson replied, his voice rough. He cleared his throat. "The kitchen is stocked. Guest room is upstairs, second door on the right. There's a bathroom attached. Clean towels in the closet. Make yourself at home." "Really? Where will you be?" "I'll stay in the master bedroom at the end of the hall." "But Frances, I'm not. This isn't." He struggled for words. "I'm not expecting anything. You're here because you need a safe place, and I owe you that. Nothing more." Frances nodded slowly. She believed him. Maybe that made her naive, but she believed him. "Okay," she said. Okay, I'll stay. For a few days. Until this calms down." Wilson's expression shifted, relief mixed with something else. Gratitude, maybe. Or hope. "Thank you," he said, "for trusting me with this." Frances wanted to say she didn't trust him. Not really, that she was just choosing the least terrible option. But looking at him standing in his dead wife's house, his eyes haunted with loss and loneliness, she realized it wasn't entirely true. She didn't trust him completely, but she trusted him enough. And maybe that was more dangerous than not trusting him at all. "I'm going to go upstairs," Frances said. "Lie down for a bit. Process all this." "Of course. I'll be in the kitchen if you need anything." Frances grabbed her duffel bag and climbed the stairs, her hand trailing along the smooth banister. The guest room was exactly as Wilson described, tasteful, comfortable, with a bay window overlooking the tree-lined street. She dropped her bag and sat on the edge of the bed, her body finally releasing the tension it had been holding all day. She was in Wilson Chambers' brownstone, alone with a man she'd met 12 hours ago, hiding from reporters who wanted to turn her life into entertainment. This was insane. But as Frances lay back on the softest mattress she'd felt in years and stared at the ceiling, she realized something else. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt safe. And that terrified her more than anything else. Frances woke to the smell of something cooking. For a disoriented moment, she thought she was back in her childhood apartment, that Mama was making breakfast before her first shift. But then she registered the softness of the sheets, the quality of the light filtering through unfamiliar curtains, and reality crashed back. Wilson's brownstone. Brooklyn Heights. Hiding from the media circus her life had become. She checked her phone, 7:23 p.m. She'd slept for 3 hours and her body felt both better and worse, rested but heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. Her screen showed 17 new missed calls and 42 unread messages. Frances turned the phone face down without looking at any of them. The smell of food drew her downstairs. She followed the aroma to the kitchen and stopped in the doorway. Wilson stood at the stove, stirring something in a large pot, his back to her. He'd changed into a worn t-shirt and those same old jeans, his feet bare on the tile floor. The kitchen itself was stunning, marble countertops, professional appliances, herbs growing in pots on the windowsill. But what caught Frances's attention was how comfortable Wilson looked. Not like a billionaire slumming it, but like someone who actually belonged in this space. "I didn't know if you'd be hungry," Wilson said without turning around. "But I figured after today, you might need something warm. How did you know I was awake?" "The stairs creak," he said, glancing over his shoulder with a small smile. "Caroline used to say this house had its own language. You learn to listen." Frances stepped into the kitchen, drawn by both the food and the unexpected intimacy of the moment. "What are you making?" "Chicken soup. From scratch." Wilson ladled some into a bowl and set it on the small breakfast table by the window. "It was Caroline's recipe. She'd make it whenever I had a bad day. Said there was nothing a good soup couldn't help you process." Frances sat down, and the first spoonful made her eyes close. Rich, flavorful, with a depth that spoke of hours of simmering. Nothing like the canned soup she heated up between shifts. This was food made with care. With love. "This is incredible," she said quietly. Wilson brought his own bowl and sat across from her. "Caroline was an amazing cook. She tried to teach me, said I needed to know how to feed myself like a human being, not just order from restaurants." His eyes grew distant. "After she died, I stopped. Couldn't stand being in the kitchen without her. But today I thought, maybe it was time." They ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the gentle clink of spoons against bowls. Frances studied Wilson in the soft kitchen light. He looked different here, younger somehow, or maybe just less burdened. In the diner, he'd been trying to disappear. In his penthouse, he'd probably been performing power. But here, in this house filled with his dead wife's love, he seemed almost real. "Can I ask you something?" Frances said. "Anything. Why did you really go to that diner this morning?" "The truth." Wilson set down his spoon and leaned back in his chair. "I was suffocating. In my life, in my world. Every person I meet wants something from me. Business, money, access, status. I can't remember the last time someone talked to me like I was just Wilson." He paused. "Caroline was the last person who saw me as a man first and a bank account second. After she died, I thought maybe I could find that again. Someone real. Something authentic. So you put on old clothes and went to Queens," Frances said, not quite able to keep the edge from her voice. "I know how it sounds," Wilson said. "Billionaire playing dress-up, slumming with the real people. But it wasn't like that. Or at least, I didn't mean it to be." He met her eyes. "I wasn't looking for entertainment, Frances. I was looking for proof that genuine human connection still existed." "And did you find it?" Wilson's gaze didn't waver. "Yes. In a note slipped under a coffee saucer by a woman brave enough to help a stranger." Frances felt heat rise to her cheeks. She looked down at her soup. "I'm not brave. I saw someone uncomfortable, and I reacted. That's all." "That's not all," Wilson said softly. "You saw danger, and you put yourself at risk to warn me. You didn't know if I'd listen. Didn't know if those men might turn on you. But you did it anyway. Maybe I'm just stupid." "You're not stupid." Wilson's voice was firm. "You're someone who still believes in helping people even when the world has given you every reason not to." Frances's throat tightened. She wanted to deflect, to make a joke, to rebuild the walls that were dangerously close to crumbling. But Wilson's eyes held hers with an intensity that made deflection impossible. "You don't know anything about my world," Frances said quietly. "About what the world has or hasn't given me." "Then tell me," Wilson said. "Help me understand." Frances shook her head. Why? So you can feel better about yourself? Add my sob story to your collection of how the other half lives. Wilson flinched like she'd slapped him. Is that really what you think of me? I don't know what to think of you, Frances admitted, her voice breaking. You're a billionaire who makes chicken soup and lives in a shrine to your dead wife. You went undercover in a diner and somehow expected not to be recognized. You're hiding me in Brooklyn Heights like I'm some kind of refugee. I don't understand you, Wilson. I don't understand any of this. I don't understand it either, Wilson said. But I'm trying. And maybe that's all we can do right now, just try. Frances pushed her bowl away, suddenly unable to eat. The exhaustion was back, but it was a different kind now, not physical, but emotional. The kind that came from holding yourself together for too long. My mama worked 4 jobs, she said finally, the words coming out rough and painful. 4 jobs, and we still couldn't keep up with the bills. She'd come home so tired she could barely stand, and I'd watch her feet bleed through her shoes because she couldn't afford new ones and she wouldn't let me go without. Frances's hands clenched into fists on the table. She died at 53. A stroke. The doctor said it was the stress, the exhaustion, the years of never resting. She died because being poor in America is a slow form of violence, and nobody cares because we're invisible. Wilson's face had gone pale. Frances. I'm 36 years old, Frances continued, unable to stop now that she'd started. I work 3 jobs. I'm 1 medical emergency away from losing everything. I haven't been to a dentist in 8 years. I own 3 pairs of pants and 5 shirts, and I rotate them so people at work don't notice. I eat ramen and cereal because that's what I can afford. And every single day, I serve people who don't see me, who look through me like I'm furniture, like I'm nothing. Tears were streaming down her face now, and she didn't bother to wipe them away. So forgive me if I don't understand why you care. Forgive me if I can't quite believe that a man worth billions gives a damn about 1 waitress from Queens who helped him escape some photographers. Because in my experience, people like you don't see people like me. Not really. The silence that followed was crushing. Frances waited for Wilson to defend himself, to make excuses, to prove her right by showing his discomfort with her pain. Instead, he did something she didn't expect. He started to cry. Not dramatic sobs, but quiet tears that slipped down his face as he looked at her with an expression of such raw anguish that Frances felt her anger falter. You're right, Wilson said, his voice thick. About all of it. I don't know your world. I've never had to count dollars or choose between food and medicine. I've never been invisible. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. But I know what it's like to lose the 1 person who saw you. I know what it's like to be surrounded by people and feel completely alone. And I know what it's like to want to give up because nothing feels real anymore. Wilson stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to her. His shoulders were rigid, his hands braced against the counter. After Caroline died, I wanted to die too, he said quietly. I thought about it constantly. What would be the easiest way? How long before someone found me? Whether anyone would actually miss me or just miss what I could do for them. He turned to face her. The only thing that stopped me was knowing Caroline would be so disappointed. She believed I was good. Believed I could use my money and power to help people. And I've tried. I've donated millions. Built schools. Funded clinics. But it all feels so hollow because I can't help the 1 person I loved most. Frances felt her own tears returning. She'd been so focused on her own pain that she hadn't fully registered his. 2 people drowning in different oceans, both convinced they were alone. I saw you in that diner, Wilson continued, his voice stronger now. And yes, I saw someone helping me. But I also saw someone who understood loneliness. Someone who moved through the world carrying weight that no one else could see. And when our eyes met, Frances, I felt something I haven't felt since Caroline died. What? Frances whispered. Hope, Wilson said simply. Hope that maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. That maybe there was still 1 person in the world who could see me without wanting something from me. Frances stood on shaking legs and walked to where Wilson stood by the window. The kitchen light cast shadows across his face, highlighting the exhaustion, the grief, the desperate hope in his eyes. I see you, Frances said softly. I see a man who's scared and lonely and trying to figure out how to live in a world that took away the person who made everything make sense. Wilson's breath hitched. And I see you. A woman who's been carrying the world on her shoulders for so long she's forgotten what it feels like to rest. A woman who's brave and kind and so much more than the uniform she wears. They stood there, inches apart, the space between them charged with everything unspoken. Frances could feel her heart hammering, could see Wilson's pulse jumping in his throat. "This is crazy," Frances breathed. "I know. We just met. I know. You're a billionaire, and I'm a waitress. This doesn't work. It can't work." "I know," Wilson said. "But Frances, I don't care." He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers were gentle, trembling slightly, and the tenderness of the gesture broke something open inside Frances's chest. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Me too. I don't know how to do this. How to be seen." "Neither do I," Wilson said. "But maybe we can figure it out together. When was the last time someone truly saw you? Not your job, not your struggles, just you. Tell us in the comments what being truly seen means to you." Frances closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of Wilson's hand still near her face. Every logical part of her brain screamed that this was a mistake, that she should pack her bag, call Shanice, and find somewhere else to weather this storm. That letting herself feel anything for this man was dangerous and foolish, and would only end in pain. But the truth was, she was already feeling it. Had been feeling it since that moment in the diner when their eyes met, and something clicked into place. "Show me," Frances said, opening her eyes. "Show me who Caroline was. Help me understand why this house matters so much." Wilson looked surprised, then grateful. "Okay. Yes. Come with me." He led her out of the kitchen and into the living room, where Frances had noticed the photos earlier. Wilson picked up a frame from the mantel. Wilson and Caroline on what looked like their wedding day, both young and glowing with joy. "We met at a coffee shop," Wilson said, smiling at the memory. "I was working on a business plan, surrounded by papers, completely in my own world. She sat down at my table without asking and said, 'You look like you could use better coffee and someone to tell you when your ideas are stupid.'" Frances laughed despite herself. "She said that. First words she ever spoke to me," Wilson confirmed. "I was so shocked I didn't know what to say. And then she read my business plan over my shoulder and proceeded to tear it apart. Told me my market analysis was weak, my financial projections were too optimistic, and my mission statement was corporate garbage that said nothing." "And you fell in love with her," Frances said. "Immediately," Wilson said. "Because she was real. She didn't care that I was trying to impress investors or that I needed to sound professional. She just cared about making the idea better." He set the photo down and picked up another. Caroline painting at an easel, sunlight streaming through a window. She was an artist. Not famous or successful by commercial standards, but incredibly talented. She taught art to kids in underprivileged neighborhoods for free. Said every child deserved to know they could create beauty. Wilson's voice cracked slightly. "When my first company sold for $200 million, the first thing she said was, 'Don't let this change who you are.' Not congratulations. Not celebration. Just a warning. Because she knew how money corrupts. How it isolates you." "Did it change you?" Frances asked gently. Wilson was quiet for a long moment. "Yes. Not right away, but gradually. The more successful I became, the harder it was to tell who was real and who was performing. Caroline tried to keep me grounded, but I got caught up in the game. The deals, the power, the recognition." He looked at Frances. "By the time she got sick, I'd become someone she barely recognized. I spent our last year together, trying to find my way back to the man she'd married." "Did you?" "I don't know," Wilson admitted. "She died before I could prove it to her. Or to myself." Frances reached out and took his hand. The gesture felt natural, necessary. Wilson's fingers closed around hers, and they stood there in the living room surrounded by photos of a love that had been real and true, and ultimately not enough to keep death at bay. "She'd want you to live," Frances said quietly. "Caroline. She'd want you to find happiness again." "How do you know?" "Because that's what you do when you love someone," Frances said, thinking of her own mother. "You want them to survive your loss. You want them to keep going, even when it hurts." Wilson pulled Frances into a hug, sudden and tight and desperate. She stiffened for only a moment before letting herself sink into it, wrapping her arms around his waist and feeling his heart beat against her cheek. They stood like that for a long time, two broken people holding each other up in a house filled with ghosts and hope. When they finally pulled apart, the air between them felt different. Lighter somehow, like sharing their pain had created space for something else to grow. "Thank you," Wilson said. "For listening. For understanding. For not running away screaming when I told you I wanted to die." "Thank you for making me soup," Frances replied. and for giving me a place to hide, and for seeing me when I thought I was invisible." Wilson smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "You were never invisible, Francis. Not to me." They went back to the kitchen and finished their soup, and this time the conversation flowed easier. Wilson told her about Caroline's love of old movies and terrible puns. Francis told him about her mother's flower garden on their fire escape, and how she'd sing while she cooked. They talked about loss and survival, and the strange ways grief manifested. They discovered they both hated mushrooms and loved thunderstorms, and could quote entire scenes from The Princess Bride. As the evening deepened into night, Frances realized something that both thrilled and terrified her. She was falling for Wilson Chambers. Not the billionaire, not the public persona, but the man sitting across from her in his dead wife's kitchen, making her laugh while tears still stained his cheeks. The man who cooked soup from memory and kept photos of his love scattered throughout the house like prayers. The man who saw her. And that realization, more than anything that had happened in the past 24 hours, changed everything. Later that night, Frances lay in the guest room staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. Down the hall, she could hear Wilson moving around in the master bedroom, probably unable to sleep either. Her phone sat on the nightstand, still full of unread messages and missed calls. Tomorrow, she'd have to deal with reality. Figure out when she could return to her life, how to manage the media attention, whether she still had jobs to go back to. But tonight, in this beautiful brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, Frances let herself feel something she hadn't allowed in years. She let herself hope. Hope that maybe being seen wasn't dangerous. That maybe opening your heart to someone didn't have to end in loss. That maybe, against all odds and logic, two lonely people could find each other and create something real. It was foolish. Naive. Probably destined to end badly. But as Frances finally drifted off to sleep, Wilson's words echoed in her mind. Hope that maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. Neither was she. Not anymore. Morning light spilled through the bay window, warm and golden, and Frances woke to the unfamiliar sensation of feeling rested. Actually rested. Not just the shallow half-sleep she usually managed between shifts, but deep, restorative rest that left her body loose and her mind clear. She stretched beneath the soft sheets and checked her phone. 9:17 a.m. When was the last time she'd slept past 6? She couldn't remember. The smell of coffee drifted up from downstairs, and Frances smiled despite herself. She pulled on the robe she'd found hanging in the closet, cream-colored and luxurious, probably Caroline's, and padded down the stairs. Wilson stood in the kitchen pouring coffee into 2 mugs, already dressed in jeans and a navy Henley. He looked up when she entered, and his face transformed with a smile that made her heart stutter. "Good morning," he said, sliding one of the mugs across the counter toward her. "I wasn't sure how you took your coffee, so I left it black. There's cream and sugar if you want." "Black's perfect," Frances said, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. She took a sip and nearly moaned. "This is incredible coffee." "Caroline's one rule: never cheap out on coffee," Wilson said. She'd drive 40 minutes to this little roaster in Red Hook because she swore they had the best beans in the city. Frances noticed he said Caroline's name easier now, without that catch in his voice. Like talking about her last night had released some of the pressure he'd been holding. "I have a proposition," Wilson said, leaning against the counter. "It's Thursday. According to my publicist, the media storm should start dying down by Saturday or Sunday. That gives us 2, maybe 3 days here." He paused. "What if we just pretended the outside world doesn't exist for a while? No phones. No news. No reporters or statements or crisis management. Just 2 people existing in this house." Frances raised an eyebrow. "You want to hide from reality?" "I want to give us both permission to breathe," Wilson said. "When was the last time you had 3 days with nothing you had to do? No shifts, no obligations, no one demanding your time." Frances thought about it. "Never. Literally never." "Then let me give you that," Wilson said softly. "Let me give us both that. 3 days where we're not a billionaire and a waitress being hunted by tabloids. Just Wilson and Frances, figuring out what happens next." Every practical bone in Frances's body said this was a terrible idea. She should be checking in with Eddie, with Shanice, making sure she still had jobs to return to. She should be managing the damage to her life, not hiding in a Brooklyn brownstone with a man she barely knew. But God, the thought of 3 days without worry, without counting pennies or forcing smiles or moving through the world like a ghost. 3 days of just being. Okay, Frances said. 3 days. Wilson's smile was radiant. Yeah, but I have conditions. Name them. 1. You teach me how to cook something that isn't ramen or cereal. 2. We watch at least one terrible movie. 3. You have to be honest with me. No billionaire performance, no trying to impress me. Just real. Deal, Wilson said immediately. But I have a condition too. What? You let yourself rest. Actually rest. No guilt, no apologies, no feeling like you should be doing something. Just be here. Can you do that? Frances felt tears prick her eyes. Such a simple request, but it felt impossibly generous. I can try. That's all I'm asking, Wilson said. They spent the morning in the kitchen, Wilson teaching Frances how to make proper French toast with brioche bread he'd had delivered from a local bakery. He showed her how to whisk the eggs with cinnamon and vanilla, how to let the bread soak but not too long, how to know when the pan was perfectly hot. Caroline learned this from her grandmother, Wilson explained, watching Frances carefully flip a piece. Her grandmother was French, lived in Paris until she was 20. Caroline said she made the best breakfast in the world. Did you know her? The grandmother? Never met her. She died before Caroline and I got together. But Caroline would tell me stories. How her grandmother survived World War II, how she fell in love with an American soldier and moved to Brooklyn. How she taught Caroline that food is love made visible. Frances plated the French toast, and they sat at the breakfast table by the window. The first bite was heaven, crispy on the outside, custardy inside, sweet and warm and perfect. Oh my God, Frances breathed. This is incredible. You made it, Wilson pointed out, looking pleased. We made it, Frances corrected. I would have burned it without you. They ate slowly, savoring each bite, and Frances realized this was the first meal in years that she'd actually tasted. Usually she ate standing up, or in her car between jobs, or over the sink at midnight, fuel not pleasure. But this was different. This was about being present, about sharing space and time with someone who wanted her there. After breakfast, Wilson gave her a proper tour of the brownstone. The parlor floor with its original hardwood and built-in bookshelves. The second floor with its bedrooms and a small office. The garden level with a studio that had been Caroline's art space, still filled with canvases and supplies, untouched since her death. Frances stood in the doorway of the studio, taking in the paintings stacked against the walls. Most were abstracts, bold colors and sweeping shapes that somehow captured emotion better than any realistic portrait could. She was really talented, Frances said softly. She was, Wilson agreed. But she never cared about being famous. She just wanted to create, to feel something and make it visible. He walked to one canvas in particular, a riot of golds and oranges and deep purples. This was the last one she worked on. Never finished it. Sometimes I come down here and stare at it, trying to figure out what she was feeling, what she was trying to say. Frances studied the painting. It was beautiful and chaotic, and somehow hopeful despite the dark undertones. I think she was trying to say that life is messy and painful, but still worth fighting for. Wilson looked at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Yeah, I think you're right. They stood together in Caroline's studio, surrounded by her work, and Frances felt the presence of the woman who'd loved Wilson so completely. But it didn't feel threatening or jealous. It felt like a blessing, like Caroline was there in the paint and canvas, giving them permission to find joy again. By afternoon, they'd migrated to the living room. Wilson had promised a terrible movie, and he delivered. A cheesy 90s action film with impossible stunts and dialogue that made them both groan and laugh in equal measure. They sprawled on the couch, Frances at one end and Wilson at the other, a bowl of popcorn between them. It felt easy, natural, like they'd done this 100 times before. Okay, no, Frances said as the hero jumped from a helicopter onto a speeding train. That's not how physics works. You think. Wilson deadpanned. Next you're going to tell me cars don't explode every time they crash. I have to believe in something, Frances shot back, and Wilson laughed, a real, unguarded sound that made her chest warm. As the movie played, they talked. About everything and nothing. Wilson told her about his first failed business, a tech startup that went bankrupt within 6 months. Frances told him about the time she accidentally gave a customer regular coffee instead of decaf, and they complained to Eddie for 20 minutes. They discovered Wilson could juggle, badly, and Frances could do a perfect cartwheel, though she refused to demonstrate in the living room. They debated whether Die Hard was a Christmas movie. Wilson said yes, Frances said absolutely not. They argued about whether pineapple belonged on pizza. Frances was pro, Wilson was horrified. And slowly, imperceptibly, the space between them on the couch grew smaller. Frances found herself leaning toward Wilson without meaning to. Wilson's arm ended up stretched across the back of the couch, his fingers occasionally brushing Frances's shoulder. When the movie ended, neither of them moved to put on another. They just sat there in the comfortable silence, the afternoon light painting the room in shades of amber. "Can I ask you something?" Frances said quietly. "Always. Are you scared of this?" She gestured between them. "Whatever this is?" Wilson turned to face her fully. "Terrified. Because for 3 years, I convinced myself I'd never feel anything again. That I'd had my chance at love and lost it, and that was just how life worked." He reached out and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "But then you appeared, and suddenly I'm feeling everything. And that's terrifying because I know how much it hurts to lose someone you love." Frances squeezed his fingers. "I'm scared too. Because men like you don't end up with women like me. Not in real life. In real life, this is a beautiful moment that ends when we go back to our separate worlds." "What if we don't?" Wilson said. "Go back to separate worlds, I mean. What if we find a way to build something real?" "Wilson, I know all the reasons it shouldn't work," Wilson interrupted gently. "The money, the media attention, the fact that we've known each other for 2 days. I know it's crazy. But Frances, crazy is the only thing that's felt right since Caroline died." Frances felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "I don't know how to do this. How to let someone in. I've spent so long being invisible, being careful, protecting myself. I don't know how to just be vulnerable." "Neither do I," Wilson admitted. "But maybe we can learn together." He reached up and wiped her tears with his thumb, the gesture so tender it made Frances's heart ache. She leaned into his touch, letting herself want him, despite all the fear. "Teach me something," Frances said suddenly. "Something Caroline taught you. Something real." Wilson thought for a moment, then stood and pulled Frances to her feet. "Come with me." He led her to Caroline's studio and walked to a cabinet in the corner. Inside were dozens of paint tubes, brushes, and blank canvases. "Caroline used to say that everyone should paint at least once in their life," Wilson explained. "Not to be good at it or create something beautiful, but just to feel what it's like to make something exist that didn't before." He pulled out 2 small canvases and a selection of paints. "So let's paint. Just us, just for fun. No judgment, no pressure. Just creation." Frances laughed. "I haven't painted since elementary school." "Perfect. Neither have I." Wilson set up the canvases on easels and handed Frances a palette and brushes. Caroline's only rule was that you had to paint how you feel, not what you think you should paint. They stood side by side, facing their blank canvases, and for a moment Frances had no idea what to do. How did you paint a feeling? How did you translate the chaos inside your chest into something visible? Then she stopped thinking and just moved. She dipped her brush in blue, deep and endless like the ocean, and swept it across the canvas. Then yellow, bright and warm. Then swirls of green and touches of purple. No plan, no design, just instinct and emotion flowing through her hands. Beside her, Wilson painted too. She caught glimpses of his canvas, bold strokes of red and orange, shapes that looked like reaching, like yearning. They painted in silence, the only sounds their breathing and the soft brush of bristles against canvas. Time became fluid. Frances lost herself in the movement, in the way colors blended and bled into each other, in the surprising joy of creating something from nothing. When she finally stepped back, her canvas was a mess of colors, chaotic and bright and somehow hopeful. It looked like morning felt, like waking up in a safe place after years of fear. "That's beautiful," Wilson said softly. "It's a disaster," Frances countered, but she was smiling. "It's honest," Wilson corrected. "That's what makes it beautiful." He showed her his painting, abstract shapes in warm colors, all seeming to reach toward a central point where the colors merged into gold. "I painted what this feels like. Being here with you. Feeling like maybe I'm reaching toward something real again." Frances's breath caught. The vulnerability in his words, in his painting, in the way he looked at her like she was something precious, it was overwhelming. "Wilson," she whispered. He set down his palette and brush and turned to face her fully. "I know it's fast. I know it's crazy. But Frances, I haven't felt alive in 3 years, and standing here with you, painting terrible abstract art in my dead wife's studio, I feel more alive than I have since she died." Frances set down her own palette, her hands shaking. I feel it too. And it terrifies me. Then be terrified with me, Wilson said. Be scared and alive and real with me. No performance. No hiding. Just us. He stepped closer, and Frances could feel the heat of him, could see the flecks of paint on his hands, could count his heartbeats and the pulse at his throat. I want to kiss you, Wilson said quietly. But only if you want that too. No pressure. No expectations. Just what you want. Frances thought about all the reasons she should say no. The impossibility of their situation. The certainty of heartbreak. The fact that she'd built walls for good reason, and letting them down meant risking everything. But she thought about Caroline's paintings, chaotic and beautiful and honest. About how life was short and cruel and often unfair. About how her mama had died never having taken a single risk for herself. Yes, Frances breathed. I want that too. Wilson cupped her face in his paint-stained hands and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative and sweet, like a question being asked. But then Frances leaned into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, and the kiss deepened. It tasted like hope and fear and 3 years of loneliness finally breaking open into something bright. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Wilson rested his forehead against hers. Wow, he whispered. Yeah, Frances agreed, her voice shaky. Wow. They stood there in Caroline's studio, surrounded by paintings and possibility, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Frances felt seen. Not as a waitress or a charity case or an invisible woman struggling through life. Just as Frances. A woman worthy of tenderness. A woman allowed to want. A woman who could be loved. And that realization, more than the kiss or the painting or the 3 days of safety, changed everything. That evening, Wilson cooked dinner. Pasta carbonara that he claimed was simple, but that Frances suspected was actually quite technical. She sat at the kitchen counter, sipping wine Wilson had pulled from a rack in the basement, and watched him work. Caroline always said cooking is the most honest thing you can do for someone, Wilson said, stirring pasta water into the egg mixture. Because you're literally sustaining them, keeping them alive. That's intimacy. Your wife was very wise, Frances said softly. She was. Wilson plated the pasta and brought it to the counter. But I think she'd like you. I think she'd appreciate how you see people. How you saw me. They ate dinner by candlelight, and the conversation flowed easier than anything Frances had ever experienced. They talked about dreams. Wilson's half-formed plan to shift his business toward sustainable technology, Frances's long-buried desire to go back to school and finish her degree. What would you study? Wilson asked. Social work, Frances said. I want to help people like my mama. People who are working themselves to death and don't know where to turn. Wilson's eyes shone. That's beautiful, Frances. Have you looked into programs? I can't afford it, Frances said simply. Student loans from my first attempt are already crushing me. I can't take on more debt. What if money wasn't an issue? Frances tensed. Wilson. I'm not offering to pay, Wilson said quickly. I'm just asking, if money truly wasn't an obstacle, would you do it? Frances thought about it. Really thought about it. Yes. In a heartbeat. Then we'll find a way, Wilson said with such certainty that Frances almost believed him. After dinner, they washed dishes together, Wilson washing, Frances drying. It was domestic and comfortable, and so far removed from Frances's daily reality that she felt like she was living someone else's life. Dance with me, Wilson said suddenly. What? He dried his hands and pulled out his phone, connecting it to a speaker on the counter. Soft jazz filled the kitchen, a woman's voice smoky and warm, singing about autumn leaves. Wilson held out his hand. Caroline and I used to dance in this kitchen all the time. It would make me so happy if we could do that. If I could make new memories here. Frances took his hand, and Wilson pulled her close. They swayed together, her head resting on his chest, his arms around her waist. It was perfect and bittersweet, dancing in a dead woman's kitchen with a man who was still learning how to live again. Thank you, Wilson whispered into her hair. For what? For being here. For giving me 3 days of feeling human again. For seeing me. Frances pulled back slightly to look up at him. Thank you for seeing me back. They kissed again, slower this time, deeper. And when the song ended and another began, they kept swaying, kept holding each other. Two people who'd been invisible for too long finally allowing themselves to be seen. Late that night, Frances lay in the guest room, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. Her mind kept replaying the day, the painting, the kiss, the dancing. The way Wilson looked at her like she mattered. A soft knock on her door made her sit up. "Come in." Wilson stood in the doorway, wearing pajama pants and a t-shirt, looking uncertain. "I couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about you down here, wondering if you were okay." "I'm okay," Francis said. "Just processing." "Can I?" Wilson hesitated. "Would it be okay if I just sat with you for a while? I don't want to presume anything, I don't want to be alone tonight." Francis's heart squeezed. She pulled back the covers on the other side of the bed. "Come here." Wilson crossed the room and slipped under the covers, keeping a respectful distance between them. They lay on their sides, facing each other in the dim light from the street. "Hi," Wilson said softly. "Hi," Francis replied. "Today was the best day I've had in 3 years," Wilson admitted. "And I'm terrified that it's going to end. That we're going to go back to the real world, and this is going to disappear." "I'm terrified too," Francis said. "But Wilson, even if this ends tomorrow, even if we can't make this work in the real world, today mattered. Today was real." Wilson reached across the space between them and took her hand. "Promise me something?" "What?" "Promise me we'll try. When we leave this house, when we go back to our lives, promise me we won't just let this go. That we'll fight for it." Francis thought about all the reasons it was a promise she couldn't keep. The gulf between their worlds. The media attention. The certainty that people would call her a gold digger or worse. But she also thought about Wilson's eyes when he kissed her. About dancing in the kitchen. About painting feelings onto canvas. About being seen. "I promise," Francis whispered. Wilson pulled her closer, until there was no space between them, until Francis's head was tucked under his chin and his arms were wrapped around her. "Sleep," Wilson murmured. "I've got you." And for the first time in her adult life, Francis felt safe enough to truly rest. Wrapped in the arms of a man who saw her. In a house filled with love's memory. In a moment stolen from reality. Tomorrow would bring complications. But tonight, they had each other. And that was enough. Francis woke to find Wilson already gone from the bed, though the sheets on his side were still warm. Sunlight streamed through the window. It was Saturday morning, the third day of their sanctuary. Monday loomed like a storm on the horizon, but for now, they still had time. She found Wilson in the kitchen staring at his phone, his expression dark. "What's wrong?" Francis asked, her stomach already sinking. Wilson looked up, and the anguish in his eyes made her breath catch. The story didn't die down. It got worse. He turned his phone toward her. The headline screamed from the screen. "Billionaire's new charity case. Waitress Frances Mitchell or gold digger in disguise?" Below it was a full exposé. Photos of Frances leaving her apartment building, information about her 3 jobs, her debt, her mother's death. They'd dug up everything. Her entire life laid bare for public consumption. But worse were the quotes from anonymous sources speculating about her motives. Was she manipulating Wilson's grief? Had she orchestrated the whole coffee shop encounter? One particularly vicious columnist wrote, "It's the oldest story in the world. Working-class woman sees her ticket out and pounces. Wilson Chambers may be brilliant in boardrooms, but he's clearly blind to opportunists who see dollar signs instead of a man." Frances felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands started shaking so badly, she had to set down the coffee cup she'd been holding. "Frances," Wilson started, but she cut him off. "Don't. Just don't." She walked out of the kitchen, up the stairs, into the guest room, and stood in the middle of the floor trying to breathe. The walls felt like they were closing in. 3 days. They'd had 3 perfect days, and now reality was crashing back in with a vengeance. Wilson appeared in the doorway. "Frances, please. Don't listen to them. It's all garbage. Anyone who knows you. Anyone who knows me?" Frances spun to face him, anger and humiliation warring in her chest. "Wilson, nobody knows me. I'm invisible, remember? I'm the waitress who pours coffee. But now I'm the gold digger. The opportunist. The woman trying to trap a grieving billionaire. That's not what happened. Isn't it?" Frances's voice cracked. "Think about how this looks. I helped you escape photographers, and now I'm staying in your brownstone. We've been hiding here together for 3 days. Of course people think I planned this. I don't care what people think." "Well, I do," Frances shouted. "Because those people are my neighbors, my co-workers, everyone in my world who's going to see me as the woman who tried to social climb her way out of Queens. Do you know what this does to me, Wilson? To my reputation? To any chance I have of going back to a normal life?" Wilson stepped into the room, his hands raised placatingly. "We can fix this." Another statement, An interview, something that tells the truth. The truth? Francis laughed bitterly. What truth? That a billionaire dressed up like a regular person to see how the poor people live. And I felt sorry for him? That we've spent 3 days playing house in his dead wife's brownstone? She stopped, her throat closing around the words she'd been about to say. That I fell in love with you. That you what? Wilson asked quietly. Francis shook her head, tears streaming down her face now. It doesn't matter. Don't you see, Wilson? This was never going to work. We're from different worlds. You can afford to not care what people think because you have money and power and privilege. But me? I have to care. Because tomorrow I have to go back to my life, to my jobs, and face everyone who thinks I'm a gold digger. Then don't go back, Wilson said desperately. Stay here. With me. Let me help you. Help me. Francis's voice rose again. That's exactly what they're saying you're doing. That I'm your charity case. Your project. The poor waitress you're trying to save. That's not. I don't see you that way. But everyone else does. Francis grabbed her duffel bag from the closet and started throwing her clothes into it. I can't do this, Wilson. I can't be the woman who let a billionaire rescue her. I can't lose myself in your world. Wilson watched her pack, his face stricken. So that's it? 3 days and you're just going to walk away. 3 days was a fantasy, Francis said, zipping her bag with shaking hands. It wasn't real life. Real life is that article. Real life is people thinking the worst of me. Real life is the fact that you and I don't make sense. We made sense for 3 days, Wilson said, his voice breaking. We made sense when you were painting in Caroline's studio. When we were dancing in the kitchen. When you slept in my arms last night. That was real, Francis. Francis closed her eyes against the pain in his voice. Maybe it was. But it can't survive out there. In the real world, where you're Wilson Chambers, billionaire CEO, and I'm Francis Mitchell, struggling waitress. The world won't let us be just Wilson and Francis. It'll always be about the money, the power, the gap between us. I don't care about the gap. But I do. Francis exploded. Because I've lived my entire life on the wrong side of it. I know what happens to women like me who get involved with men like you. We become cautionary tales. We become punchlines. We lose ourselves trying to fit into worlds we were never meant to inhabit. Wilson's face had gone pale. Is that really what you think? That being with me means losing yourself. I think being with you means becoming someone I'm not, Francis said, her voice thick with tears. And I've spent too long being invisible to trade that for being a spectacle. Silence fell between them, heavy and suffocating. Wilson stood in the doorway, his hands clenched at his sides, looking like Francis had physically struck him. I thought you saw me, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought you understood that I'm not my money or my company. That I'm just a man trying to figure out how to live again. And I thought you saw me, Francis countered. But maybe you just saw a project. A way to feel better about yourself. Poor Wilson, so lonely in his mansion, helps struggling waitress and gets to feel like a hero. Wilson flinched like she'd slapped him. That's not fair. None of this is fair. Francis grabbed her bag and moved toward the door, forcing Wilson to step aside. You asked me for 3 days. I gave them to you. But I can't give you my whole life, Wilson. I can't give you everything I am and watch the world tear it apart. She pushed past him and headed down the stairs, her vision blurred with tears. She could hear Wilson following behind her. Francis, please. Don't do this. Don't let them win. Francis spun around at the bottom of the stairs. They already won, Wilson. The moment we crossed paths, they won. Because people like you and people like me, we don't get happy endings. We get headlines and speculation and judgment. So you're just going to run? Wilson's voice had an edge now, anger mixing with his desperation. You're going to let fear make this decision? I'm not running, Francis said coldly. I'm protecting myself. Something I should have done from the beginning. By pushing away the first real thing either of us has felt in years. By recognizing reality before it destroys me completely. Wilson descended the last few stairs until he was standing directly in front of her. You know what I think? I think you're terrified. Not of what the world thinks, but of what you feel. I think you're so used to being alone, to protecting yourself, that the moment someone actually sees you, actually wants you, you panic and run. His words hit too close to home, and Francis's anger flared hot and defensive. Don't you dare analyze me like I'm some kind of psychology case study. You don't know me, Wilson. 3 days doesn't mean you know me. I know you're brave enough to help strangers, but too scared to help yourself. Wilson shot back. I know you paint with colors that scream hope even when you claim to have none. I know you sleep like you're waiting for something bad to happen. And I know you felt what I felt these past 3 days, but you're too afraid to admit it. You want to know what I felt? Frances shouted, tears streaming down her face. I felt like I was playing pretend. Like I was trying on a life that could never be mine. This brownstone, these clothes, this fantasy of being with someone who actually sees me. It's all pretend, Wilson. And I can't afford to forget that. It's not pretend. Wilson's voice cracked. My feelings aren't pretend. The way he stopped himself, breathing hard. The way you what? Frances challenged. The way I love you, Wilson said quietly, and the words landed between them like a bomb. I love you, Frances. I fell in love with you somewhere between that note in the diner and painting in Caroline's studio and dancing in the kitchen at midnight. And I know it's fast and I know it's crazy, but it's real. And you love me too. I know you do. Frances felt like she couldn't breathe. The words she'd been so careful not to say, not to feel, hanging in the air between them. Don't, she whispered. Don't what? Don't love you? Too late. Don't tell you? You deserve to know. Don't fight for this? I'm not Caroline, Frances. I'm not going to just let the woman I love walk away without fighting. You barely knew Caroline. Frances exploded and immediately regretted it. But the words kept coming, cruel and desperate. You said it yourself. By the time she got sick, you'd become someone she didn't recognize. So maybe you don't know love as well as you think you do. Maybe you just know grief and loneliness, and you're confusing that with love. Wilson staggered back like she'd hit him. His face went white, then flushed with anger and pain. How dare you, he said, his voice shaking. How dare you use Caroline against me? Use my grief as a weapon. I'm not. Yes, you are, Wilson said. You're doing exactly what you accused the world of doing to you, reducing me to one thing. The grieving widower who doesn't know his own mind. The rich man who can't possibly understand real emotion. You're putting me in a box so you don't have to deal with what's actually happening here. And what's happening here, Wilson? Frances demanded. You tell me, because from where I'm standing, it looks like 2 lonely people who spent 3 days pretending their problems didn't exist. That's not love. That's escapism. That's bullshit and you know it, Wilson said. What happened here was real. The conversations, the vulnerability, the connection, all of it was real. But you're so determined to protect yourself that you'd rather destroy it than risk being hurt. You don't know what you're asking me to risk, Frances shouted. My reputation, my dignity, my sense of self. You get to go back to your penthouse and your company and your life. What do I go back to? Being known as the woman who tried to trap Wilson Chambers? Being stared at and judged and mocked. You go back to being yourself, Wilson said firmly. Strong, kind, beautiful Frances who doesn't need me or my money or my world. You go back to being the woman who helped a stranger because it was the right thing to do. The woman who paints with hope and dances like joy matters. That woman doesn't need anyone's approval. That woman doesn't exist, Frances cried. She's who I pretended to be for 3 days in a beautiful house where reality couldn't touch us. Real Frances is exhausted and broke and invisible. Real Frances knows that fairy tales don't come true, and billionaires don't fall in love with waitresses. Stop calling yourself a waitress like it defines you, Wilson said, frustrated. You're Frances Mitchell. You're intelligent and compassionate and stronger than anyone I've ever met. The job you do doesn't change that. But it does, Frances said bitterly. It changes everything. Because in your world, what I do makes me less than. Makes me someone people assume is after your money. And I can't live like that, Wilson. I can't spend my life proving I'm not what everyone thinks I am. Wilson ran his hands through his hair, his composure cracking. So what do you want me to say? That I'll give up my money? That I'll pretend to be someone I'm not so people won't judge us? I did that already, Frances. I went undercover in Queens trying to find something real. And I found you. I'm not going to apologize for who I am. I'm not asking you to apologize. Frances shouted. I'm asking you to understand that who you are makes this impossible. The only thing making this impossible is your fear. They stood there, both breathing hard, both with tears streaming down their faces. The beautiful brownstone that had been their sanctuary for 3 days now felt like a cage. I can't do this, Frances said finally, her voice broken. I can't be the woman you need me to be. I don't need you to be anyone but yourself, Wilson said desperately. You need me to be brave enough to face the world's judgment, Frances said. And I'm not. I'm just a woman who's tired of fighting, tired of struggling, tired of hoping for things that never come true. She picked up her bag and walked to the door. Wilson didn't try to stop her this time. "If you walk out that door," Wilson said quietly, "if you give up on us because you're scared, then maybe you're right. Maybe you're not the woman I thought you were." Frances's hand froze on the doorknob. The words cut deeper than anything else he'd said because they echoed her own worst fear, that she was exactly who the world said she was. Weak. Small. Unworthy of love. "Maybe I'm not," Frances said without turning around. "Maybe I'm just a waitress who should have stayed invisible." She opened the door and stepped out into the cold morning air, leaving Wilson standing in the foyer of his dead wife's brownstone, surrounded by the ghosts of love lost and love destroyed. Frances walked down the street without looking back, her vision blurred with tears, her heart shattering with every step. She'd promised Wilson 3 days. She'd given him that. But she couldn't give him forever. Not when forever meant becoming someone else. Not when forever meant facing a world that would never accept them. Not when she was too broken to believe in fairy tales anymore. Behind her, the door to the brownstone closed with a soft click. And Frances kept walking. Wilson stood alone in the foyer, Caroline's house echoing with emptiness, and for the first time since his wife died, he wondered if he'd ever feel anything but pain again. He'd opened his heart, risked everything, told Frances he loved her, and she'd walked away, just like he'd known she would. Just like everyone eventually did when they realized loving him meant living in his complicated, scrutinized world. Wilson walked to the living room and sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. Caroline's photos stared at him from their frames, and he could almost hear her voice. "Don't let her go. Fight for her." But how did you fight for someone who didn't want to be fought for? How did you love someone who couldn't believe they deserved to be loved? Wilson pulled out his phone and stared at it. He could call her, could beg her to come back, could promise to fix everything. But promises felt hollow now. Words felt meaningless. Frances had made her choice. She'd chosen fear over faith. Protection over possibility. And Wilson was alone again. The brownstone felt like a mausoleum. A beautiful, empty monument to love that couldn't survive the weight of the world. Wilson closed his eyes and let himself feel the full measure of his heartbreak. Because loving Frances Mitchell, really loving her, meant respecting her choice. Even if that choice destroyed him. Frances sat in Shanice's tiny apartment in the Bronx, staring at a cup of tea she hadn't touched in 40 minutes. Outside, the city rumbled with its usual Saturday chaos, sirens, music, arguments filtering through thin walls. Inside, silence pressed down like a weight. "Girl, you gonna tell me what happened or just sit there looking like somebody died?" Shanice finally asked, perched on the arm of the couch, her expression caught between concern and frustration. Frances blinked, as if remembering where she was. She'd shown up at Shanice's door 2 hours ago, bag in hand, eyes swollen from crying. Shanice had let her in without questions, made tea, and waited. "I left," Frances said, her voice hollow. "Left where?" "The brownstone." "Him." "I left Wilson." Shanice was quiet for a moment. "Okay. Why?" "Because it was never going to work," Frances said flatly. "Because the media thinks I'm a gold digger. Because we're from different worlds. Because," her voice cracked, "because I'm not brave enough for this." "For what?" "Love." The word landed like a punch. Frances closed her eyes. "He said he loved me." "And what did you say?" "I told him he barely knew Caroline. That he was confusing grief with love. That what we had was escapism, not real." Frances's voice broke completely. "I said terrible things, Shanice. I hurt him on purpose because I was scared." Shanice slid off the couch arm and sat beside Frances, taking her hands. "Baby, look at me." Frances met her friend's eyes. "Do you love him?" Frances's answer came out as a sob. "Yes. God help me, yes. I love him so much it terrifies me." "Then why?" "Because love isn't enough." Frances pulled her hands away and stood, pacing the small living room. "You didn't see that article. They called me a charity case. An opportunist. They dug up everything about my life, Mama's death, my debt, my jobs. They made me sound pathetic and calculating at the same time. And that's just the beginning, Shanice. If I stay with Wilson, if I try to make this work, that's my life forever. Always being judged. Always being the waitress who trapped the billionaire. Or," Shanice said calmly, "you could be the woman who fell in love and chose to be happy despite what anyone else thinks. Easy for you to say. Your boyfriend isn't worth $3 billion. "No, but Deshawn was in prison for 3 years before we got together," Shanice said quietly. You think people didn't talk? You think my mama didn't cry and beg me to find someone without baggage? You think I didn't hear the whispers at church, the side eyes from neighbors? She stood and faced Francis. But I loved him. I saw who he was underneath what the world decided he was. And I chose to fight for that. To fight for us. Francis felt fresh tears streaming down her face. I'm not as strong as you. Bullshit, Shanice said firmly. You work 3 jobs. You put yourself through hell to keep food on your table and a roof over your head. You helped your mama through cancer, even though it broke you financially and emotionally. You're one of the strongest women I know, Frances Mitchell. So don't you dare tell me you're not strong enough for love. It's different. How? How is it different? Because he has money? Money doesn't make love easier or harder, Francis. Fear does. And you're letting fear win. Frances sank back onto the couch, her energy spent. What if I try and it doesn't work? What if I go back to him and the world tears us apart anyway? What if I lose myself trying to fit into his life? What if you don't try and spend the rest of your life wondering, what if? Shanice countered. What if he's the man who finally sees you, who finally values you the way you deserve, and you threw it away because you were scared? Frances buried her face in her hands. I don't know what to do. Yes, you do, Shanice said gently. You're just scared to do it. Across the city, Wilson sat in his penthouse. Not the brownstone, he couldn't face that yet, staring at the view he'd once thought meant success. The city glittered below, thousands of lights representing thousands of lives, and he'd never felt more disconnected from all of it. His phone rang. Veronica, his publicist. I'm not in the mood, Wilson said by way of greeting. Too bad. We need to talk about damage control. Veronica's voice was crisp, professional. The Frances Mitchell situation is spiraling. We need a statement from you, something definitive that shuts this down. What kind of statement? Confirming that your relationship with Ms. Mitchell was brief and has ended. That you wish her well. That you're focusing on your business and honoring Caroline's memory. Clean. Simple. Done. Wilson's jaw clenched. No. Excuse me? I said no. I'm not making a statement about Frances. Wilson, the longer this drags on, the worse it gets for both of you. The narrative right now is that she's using you, which makes you look foolish and her look predatory. A clean break statement benefits everyone. Or, Wilson said slowly, it confirms every terrible thing they're saying about her. That she was temporary, disposable, not worth fighting for. She's not in your life anymore, Veronica said bluntly. According to my sources, she left this morning. Whatever you two had is over. So why not make it official and move on? Wilson stood and walked to the window. What if I don't want to move on? Silence on the other end. Then, are you serious right now? I love her, Veronica. I'm in love with Frances Mitchell. And yes, she left. Yes, she's scared. But I'm not going to throw her to the wolves with some corporate statement that confirms she meant nothing to me. Wilson, Veronica's voice softened slightly. I understand you have feelings. But this woman walked away. She made her choice. You can't force someone to want your life. I don't want her to want my life, Wilson said. I want her to want me. Just me. Not the money or the penthouses or the power. Just Wilson. That's a beautiful sentiment, Veronica said gently. But in the real world, you can't separate those things. Your money is part of who you are. Your life is what it is. And if she can't accept that, then maybe my life needs to change, Wilson interrupted. What are you talking about? Wilson stared at his reflection in the window. Expensive suit, perfect hair, the polished version of himself he presented to the world. When had he become this person? When had the performance become permanent? I'm talking about being honest, Wilson said. About who I am and what I want. Not what the board wants, or what the media expects, or what makes good business sense. What I want. And what do you want? I want Frances, Wilson said simply. I want to build a life with a woman who sees me, who challenges me, who makes me want to be better, not richer. I want what I had with Caroline, something real. Caroline understood your world, Veronica pointed out. She grew up in it, understood the pressures, knew how to navigate it. Frances Mitchell is. Everything Caroline would have wanted for me, Wilson finished. Caroline told me before she died that she didn't want me to be alone forever. That she wanted me to find joy again. Frances is that joy, Veronica. And I'm not going to let her go without a fight. Veronica sighed. Then what do you want to do? Wilson thought about Frances in his arms, painting in Caroline's studio, dancing in the kitchen. He thought about her strength and her fear and her desperate need to protect herself. He thought about the things he'd said to her in anger. The way they'd hurt each other with words meant to wound. I need to go to her, Wilson said. I need to tell her the truth, all of it. No corporate statements, no damage control. Just me, being honest about who I am and what I feel. That's a terrible idea, Veronica said. If you do this publicly, if you confirm your feelings for her, the media will intensify. The scrutiny will get worse, not better. I know, Wilson said. But I can't control what the media says. I can only control what I do. And I'm done hiding. I'm done pretending to be something I'm not. If I'm going to have any chance with Frances, she needs to see that I'm willing to risk everything. Just like I'm asking her to risk. This could backfire spectacularly. I know, Wilson said again. But doing nothing, letting her believe I don't care enough to fight, that's the real disaster. He could hear Veronica typing. Okay, if you're determined to do this, we do it right. No ambushes. No public declarations that make her feel cornered. You talk to her privately first. If, and this is a big if, she's receptive, then we'll figure out next steps. Agreed. And Wilson? Veronica's voice was unusually soft. I hope she's worth it. She is, Wilson said without hesitation. She's worth everything. Frances spent the rest of Saturday and all of Sunday in a haze. She called Eddie and told him she could come back to work Monday. He was kind but distant. The media attention had been hard on the diner, and Frances could hear the unspoken message. Maybe it was time for her to find another job. She called the convenience store and her cleaning service. Both managers were reviewing her employment status. Translation: waiting to see if the media circus died down before deciding whether to keep her. Her life was falling apart. And the worst part was, she'd done it to herself. Sunday night, Frances lay in Shanice's guest room. Really just a corner of the living room separated by a curtain, and let herself think about Wilson. Really think about him, without the fear and panic clouding her judgment. She thought about his laugh. The way he'd looked at her while teaching her to cook. The gentleness in his hands when he'd wiped her tears. The vulnerability in his voice when he talked about Caroline. She thought about his paintings, those reaching shapes and warm colors, all flowing toward a central point of gold. I painted what this feels like. Being here with you. She thought about dancing in the kitchen to old jazz, about Wilson whispering, "I've got you," before she fell asleep. She thought about the moment he'd said, "I love you," and the moment she'd destroyed him for saying it. Frances pulled out her phone. She'd turned it off after leaving the brownstone, unable to face the messages and calls. Now she powered it on, and notifications flooded the screen. Dozens of texts from numbers she didn't recognize. News alerts about the Wilson Chambers situation. 3 voicemails from Eddie. 5 from Shanice before Frances had shown up at her door. And 1 text from Wilson, sent Saturday afternoon. I know you're scared. I know I pushed too hard. But Frances, please know this. I meant what I said. Every word. If you ever want to talk, really talk, not fight, I'm here. Always. W. Frances read the message 5 times, her heart breaking a little more with each pass. He wasn't angry. Wasn't accusing her of anything. Just there. Waiting. Patient. She thought about what Shanice had said. What if he's the man who finally sees you, and you threw it away because you were scared? Frances looked around Shanice's small apartment. This was her life, borrowed spaces, borrowed time, always one disaster away from losing everything. She'd spent so long being careful, being invisible, protecting herself from risk. And where had it gotten her? Alone. Exhausted. Watching the best thing that had ever happened to her walk away because she was too afraid to hold on. Caroline's voice echoed in her memory, or maybe it was her mama's voice. They sounded similar in her mind. You've got a light in you. Don't let this world snuff it out. Frances had been letting the world snuff it out for years. Every time she swallowed her dreams to work another shift. Every time she made herself invisible to avoid being seen. Every time she chose safety over possibility. Wilson had seen her light. Had loved it. Had loved her. And she'd walked away. Frances sat up in bed, her heart pounding. It was 11:47 p.m. on Sunday night. In 13 minutes, it would be Monday. Back to reality, back to decisions that couldn't be unmade. She could stay here. Go back to her jobs if they'd still have her. Wait for the media attention to die down and return to her invisible life. Safe. Predictable. Alone. Where she could take the biggest risk of her life. Frances grabbed her phone and opened a new text to Wilson. Her hands shook as she typed. Can we talk? Really talk, like you said? I'm scared and I said terrible things, and I don't know if you can forgive me, but I need to try. I need to tell you the truth. All of it. F. She hit send before she could second guess herself. Then she waited. 1 minute. 2. 5. Her phone buzzed. Yes. Where are you? I'll come to you. W. Frances's breath caught. She looked around Shanice's apartment. Shanice already asleep on her own bed across the room. The space too small for a private conversation about life-changing choices. She typed, "The brownstone? If that's okay. I can be there in an hour." F. The response was immediate. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. I never left. Been sleeping in the studio because I couldn't leave the place where we were happy." W. Frances felt tears slip down her face. He'd been there. In the brownstone. Sleeping in Caroline's studio surrounded by their paintings and memories. Waiting for her. Frances stood and quickly pulled on clothes. She wrote a note for Shanice. "Gone to fix the biggest mistake of my life. Thank you for everything. Love you. F." Then she grabbed her jacket and headed out into the November night. The subway ride to Brooklyn Heights took 45 minutes, and every minute felt like an eternity. Frances's mind raced with everything she wanted to say, everything she needed Wilson to understand. She wasn't sure what would happen. Wasn't sure if 3 days of happiness and 1 day of heartbreak could be salvaged. Wasn't sure if love was enough to bridge the gap between their worlds. But she knew she had to try. Because Shanice was right. Wilson was right. Even Frances's own broken heart was right. She loved Wilson Chambers. And love, real, terrifying, imperfect love, was worth fighting for. The brownstone appeared ahead, lit warmly from within. Frances stood on the sidewalk for a moment, gathering her courage. Then the door opened. Wilson stood in the doorway, wearing the same worn jeans and t-shirt from their first night, his hair disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed but hopeful. "You came," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I came," Frances confirmed. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure either," Frances admitted. "But I'm here. And I'm ready to talk. Really talk. No running. No fighting. Just honesty." Wilson stepped aside. "Come in. Please." Frances climbed the steps and walked into the foyer. The brownstone still smelled like coffee and memories. Still felt like the only place in the world where she'd ever truly been safe. Wilson closed the door behind her, and they stood facing each other in the space where everything had shattered less than 48 hours ago. "I'm sorry," they said simultaneously, then both stopped. "You first," Wilson said. Frances took a deep breath. This was it. The moment that would decide everything. "I'm sorry for what I said about Caroline. For using your grief as a weapon. For being cruel when I was really just terrified." The words came faster now. "You were right about me. I am scared. Scared of being seen, scared of wanting something I'm not supposed to have, scared of being the woman in the headlines instead of the woman pouring coffee." Wilson started to speak, but Frances held up her hand. "Let me finish. Please." He nodded, and she continued. "I spent my whole life being invisible because being seen meant being judged. Being found lacking. My mama was seen by bill collectors and hospital administrators and everyone who told her she wasn't enough. And I watched that kill her. So I learned to be invisible. To not want things. To not reach for more." Frances's voice broke. "And then you saw me. Really saw me. And it was the most terrifying, beautiful thing that's ever happened to me. Because wanting you, loving you, meant risking everything. Meant being visible in the worst possible way, as the woman who doesn't belong in your world." "Frances." "But here's what I realized," Frances interrupted, her voice stronger now. "I don't belong in your world. And you know what? I don't want to. I don't want penthouses and galas and perfect corporate statements. But Wilson, I want you. Just you. The man who makes soup from memory and cries over paintings and dances in the kitchen at midnight. The man who's learning how to live again after losing everything." She stepped closer to him. "I love you. I've loved you since you looked at me in that diner like I mattered. And I'm terrified of what that means, of what the world will do to us. But I'm more terrified of spending the rest of my life wondering, what if?" Silence filled the space between them. Wilson's eyes were bright with tears. "Are you done?" he asked gently. "Yes. My turn," Wilson said. He closed the distance between them, standing close enough that Frances could feel his warmth. "I'm sorry for pushing you too hard. For not understanding what I was asking you to risk. For saying you weren't the woman I thought you were. That was cruel and wrong, and you didn't deserve it." He reached up and cupped her face in his hands. You are exactly the woman I thought you were. Strong and scared and brave and careful, and so much more than you think you are. And you're right, my world is toxic and judgmental, and it will be hard. But Francis, I don't want you to fit into my world. I want to build a new world. Our world. One where we're just Wilson and Francis, figuring it out together. How? Francis whispered. How do we do that when the whole world is watching? We be honest, Wilson said simply. We tell the truth. We don't hide or perform or pretend. We just love each other as loudly and publicly as they hate us. And we trust that love is stronger than judgment. That sounds impossible. It probably is, Wilson agreed. But so was 3 days in this brownstone feeling more alive than I have in years. So was falling in love with a woman I met over black coffee. So was believing I could be happy again after Caroline died. He pressed his forehead to hers. I'm done with possible, Francis. I want impossible. I want you. Francis closed her eyes, feeling his breath mingle with hers. I want you too. God help me, I want you so much. Then choose me, Wilson said. Choose us. Choose impossible. Francis opened her eyes and looked at the man she loved. Saw his hope and his fear and his absolute certainty that they could make this work if they were brave enough to try. She thought about her mama. About Caroline. About all the women who'd fought for love and lost and still believed it was worth fighting for. She thought about being invisible versus being seen. Safe versus sorry. Alone versus loved. And she made her choice. Yes, Francis breathed. I choose you. I choose us. I choose impossible. Wilson's smile was radiant. Yeah. But Wilson, I need you to know. I'm still going to be scared. I'm still going to struggle. I'm not going to magically become comfortable with your world. I don't want you comfortable, Wilson said. I want you real. I want your fear and your strength and your terrible abstract paintings and your perfect French toast. I want all of it, Francis. All of you. Then you've got me, Francis said. All of me. For as long as you'll have me. Forever, Wilson said. I want forever. And then he kissed her. It was different from their first kiss, less tentative, more certain. It tasted like tears and hope and promises being made. It tasted like coming home. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Wilson took her hand. Come with me, he said. He led her to Caroline's studio. Their paintings still sat on the easels, Francis's chaotic burst of colors, Wilson's reaching shapes of gold. I have something for you, Wilson said. He walked to a covered canvas in the corner and pulled off the sheet. Underneath was a painting, clearly Wilson's work, but more refined than what he'd done before. It showed 2 figures rendered in abstract shapes, reaching toward each other across a space filled with obstacles. Dark shapes that could have been walls or barriers. But where the figures met in the center, light exploded in golds and whites and colors that Francis recognized from her own painting. I spent all of yesterday and today painting this, Wilson said quietly. It's us. Reaching through all the barriers, the money, the judgment, the fear, the impossibility of it all. And in the middle, where we meet, everything becomes light. Francis felt tears streaming down her face. It's beautiful. It's us, Wilson repeated. If you'll have me. All my mess and money and complications. All my grief and hope and desperate love. Will you have me, Francis? Francis looked at the painting, at the man who'd created it, at the studio filled with a dead woman's blessing. Yes, she said firmly. Yes to all of it. The mess and the complications and the impossible love. Yes, Wilson. I'll have you. Wilson pulled her into his arms, and they stood there in Caroline's studio, holding each other while the city hummed outside and the future stretched uncertain before them. We'll figure it out, Wilson promised. Together. One day at a time. One day at a time, Francis agreed. And for the first time in her life, Francis Mitchell believed that the impossible might actually be possible. As long as they chose each other. 3 months later, Francis stood in front of the mirror in the Brownstones' guest room. Though it was her room now, filled with her clothes and books and the small things that made a space feel like home. Adjusting the collar of a dress she'd bought herself with money from her first paycheck at her new job. You look beautiful, Wilson said from the doorway, and Francis turned to see him leaning against the frame, wearing jeans and a sweater that made him look more like the man from the diner than the billionaire from the headlines. I look nervous, Francis corrected. That too, Wilson admitted with a smile. But beautiful nervous. Today was the day. After 3 months of quiet rebuilding, of learning how to be Wilson and Frances in a world that wanted them to be something else. They were finally ready to step into the light on their own terms. "Are you sure about this?" Frances asked, not for the first time that morning. Wilson crossed the room and took her hands. "I've never been more sure of anything. Except maybe that first cup of coffee you poured me." Frances laughed despite her nerves. 3 months had done that, given them the ability to find humor in the thing that had brought them together and nearly torn them apart. The weeks after their reunion had been challenging in ways Frances hadn't anticipated. Not because of Wilson, he'd been patient and understanding and exactly the partner she needed, but because Frances had to learn how to exist in a space between her old world and Wilson's without losing herself in either. Wilson had insisted she keep working, at least initially. "Not because you need to prove anything," he'd explained, "but because I know what it's like to have your identity stripped away. If the diner is part of who you are, I don't want to take that from you." So Frances had gone back to Rosie's. Eddie had welcomed her with open arms and apologized for his coldness. The other waitresses had been curious but kind. The regulars had mostly treated her the same, though a few asked for her autograph, which was surreal and uncomfortable but also oddly validating. But after a month, Frances realized something. She didn't want to keep working at Rosie's. Not because she was ashamed of it, but because it was time to move forward. Time to chase the dream she'd buried years ago. With Wilson's support, but not his money, she'd been adamant about that, Frances had applied to 3 social work programs in the city. 2 had accepted her. She'd enrolled in classes that started in January, and to pay for it, she'd taken a part-time job at a nonprofit that helped working-class families navigate social services. "I want to earn this," she'd told Wilson. "I want to know I did it myself." "You are doing it yourself," Wilson had replied. "Accepting help isn't the same as being dependent. It took me a long time to learn that after Caroline died. Let the people who love you support you, Frances. That's what love is." So Frances had learned to accept. Small things at first: Wilson cooking dinner, helping her study, driving her to work when the subway was a mess. Slowly, she'd learned that accepting kindness didn't make her weak or indebted. It made her loved. Wilson had changed too. He'd started a foundation in Caroline's name focused on supporting artists and educators in underprivileged communities. He spent less time in board meetings and more time visiting the programs they funded, talking to the people they helped. "You reminded me why I built this company in the first place," he'd told Frances one night as they painted side by side in the studio. "Not to accumulate wealth, but to create opportunities. To help people build better lives. Caroline knew that. And I forgot. But you helped me remember." They'd had hard days too. Days when Frances spiraled into anxiety about what people thought. Days when Wilson's work demanded more than Frances felt prepared to handle. Days when they fought about money or time, or the constant low-level scrutiny that came with dating someone famous. But they'd learned to fight fair. To apologize quickly. To remember that they were on the same team, even when it felt like the world was against them. And slowly, painfully, beautifully, they'd built something real. Now, 3 months later, they were ready to tell their story. Not through a corporate statement or a tabloid exclusive, but on their own terms. Wilson had arranged for a journalist he trusted, a woman named Patricia Chun who'd written thoughtful pieces about grief, class, and the complications of modern love, to interview them for a long-form profile. Not a puff piece, not damage control, but an honest conversation about who they were and what they'd found in each other. The interview was scheduled for that afternoon at the Brownstone. Patricia would spend 3 hours with them, asking questions, taking photos, capturing the truth of their relationship. What if we say the wrong thing? Frances worried as they headed downstairs. What if I come across as defensive, or you seem out of touch, or... Wilson stopped on the stairs and turned to face her. Then we'll come across as human. That's all we can be, Frances. Perfectly imperfect humans trying to love each other. Frances took a deep breath and nodded. Okay, human. I can do human. You're the best at being human, Wilson said, kissing her forehead. It's one of the things I love most about you. They reached the kitchen just as the doorbell rang. Wilson squeezed Frances's hand once, "We've got this," and went to answer it. Patricia Chun was in her 50s, with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who'd earned their wisdom through experience. She shook Wilson's hand warmly, then turned to Frances with a smile that held no judgment. "Frances Mitchell, thank you for agreeing to this. I know it's not easy. Thank you for being willing to tell our story honestly," Frances replied. They settled in the living room. The same room where Frances had first learned about Caroline, where she and Wilson had discovered they shared a love of terrible movies and impossible dreams. Patricia set up her recorder and notepad, and for a moment, Frances felt her anxiety spike. But then Wilson reached over and took her hand, and she remembered. They were doing this together. So, Patricia began, let's start with the coffee shop. For 3 hours they talked. About the note, the escape, the 3 days in the brownstone. About the media storm and the terrible things said. About Frances's fear and Wilson's grief. About Caroline and Frances's mother and the ways loss shapes us. Patricia asked hard questions. About the wealth gap. About how they navigated their different worlds. About whether they worried their relationship was built on a foundation too unstable to last. Wilson answered with his characteristic honesty. Of course we worry. Anyone who says they don't is lying. But I've learned that certainty is overrated. Caroline and I had certainty. We were going to grow old together. And then she got sick, and all that certainty meant nothing. What matters isn't knowing the future. It's choosing each other every day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Frances talked about her journey from invisibility to visibility. I spent my whole life trying not to be seen because being seen meant being judged. But Wilson taught me that being seen also means being loved. And yes, the judgment is real and it hurts. People still call me a gold digger. Still say I don't belong. But the people who matter, my friend Shanice, my co-workers at the nonprofit, Wilson's small circle of real friends, they see the truth. And that's enough. Patricia asked about marriage, and Frances felt Wilson tense slightly beside her. We haven't talked about that yet, Frances said carefully. We're taking things one day at a time. Building a foundation first. Making sure we're choosing each other for the right reasons. And what are the right reasons? Patricia asked. Frances looked at Wilson, and he looked back, and the answer was clear in both their eyes. Love, Frances said simply. Not convenience or money or fear of being alone. Just love. Messy, complicated, impossible love. But is love enough? Patricia pressed gently. Given everything you're up against? Wilson leaned forward. No, love isn't enough on its own. You also need respect, communication, willingness to grow, and the courage to keep choosing each other when it would be easier to walk away. But love is the foundation. And if the foundation is strong, you can build anything on top of it. Patricia smiled. That's beautiful. Did Caroline teach you that? No, Wilson said, squeezing Frances's hand. Frances did. When the interview ended, Patricia packed up her equipment and paused at the door. For what it's worth, she said, I've interviewed hundreds of couples over my career. Politicians, celebrities, people who look perfect on paper. And most of them are performing, playing roles. But you too. She smiled. You two are real. And that's rarer than you might think. After Patricia left, Wilson and Frances stood in the foyer, processing what had just happened. We did it, Frances said, slightly stunned. We told our story. We did, Wilson confirmed. How do you feel? Frances thought about it. Vulnerable. Exposed. But also relieved? Like we're not hiding anymore. We're not, Wilson said. From this point forward, whatever happens, we face it together. Out in the open. Frances looked around the brownstone, their home now, filled with both Caroline's memory and their future. On the mantel sat a new addition. The painting Wilson had made of them reaching through barriers toward light. Beside it, a photo from last month. Wilson and Frances at the nonprofit's holiday party, both laughing, both clearly, undeniably in love. I'm still scared sometimes, Frances admitted. Scared that this is too good. That something will take it away. I know, Wilson said. I'm scared too. But I'm learning that fear doesn't have to be the thing that decides. We can be scared and still choose this. Choose us. Frances pulled him close. I love you, Wilson Chambers. Even when you leave your socks on the bathroom floor and burn the toast and hog the blankets. Wilson laughed. I love you too, Frances Mitchell. Even when you wake up at 5 a.m. out of habit and reorganize my entire kitchen and cry at dog food commercials. They stood there, holding each other, two people who'd been invisible in different ways finally allowing themselves to be fully, terrifyingly seen. What happens now? Frances asked. Now. Wilson pulled back to look at her. Now we live. We go to your classes and my foundation meetings and our weekly painting sessions. We have dinner with Shanice and Deshawn. We argue about whose turn it is to do dishes. We build a life. A boring, normal life? The most boring, normal, impossibly beautiful life, Wilson confirmed. What does love mean to you? Not the fairy tale version, but the real, messy, everyday kind. Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. 6 weeks later, Patricia's article was published. The headline read, "The Billionaire and the Waitress, a love story about seeing and being seen." It was honest, nuanced, and deeply human. Patricia had captured their complexity, the challenges they faced, the ways they'd grown, the reality that their relationship wasn't a fairy tale, but something harder and more real. The response was mixed. Some people were moved by their honesty. Others remained convinced Frances was a gold digger. Some thought Wilson was naive. Others celebrated their courage. But something unexpected happened. The conversation shifted. Other people started sharing their own stories of crossing class divides, of finding love in unexpected places, of being judged for who they loved. Frances received dozens of messages from women, waitresses, retail workers, nurses, who'd felt invisible their whole lives. They thanked her for speaking up, for showing that being seen was worth the risk. Wilson received messages too, mostly from men who'd lost spouses and thought they'd never love again. They thanked him for showing that it was possible to honor the past while building a future. Not everyone understood. Not everyone supported them. But enough people did that Frances and Wilson began to believe what they'd told Patricia. Love might not be enough on its own, but with respect, communication, and courage, it could be transformative. On a cold March evening, 8 months after that first cup of coffee, Wilson asked Frances to meet him in Caroline's studio. She found him standing in front of a new painting, one she hadn't seen him working on. It was their brownstone, rendered in warm colors, with 2 figures visible through the window. One clearly painting, one clearly watching. The whole scene glowed with golden light. "This is home," Wilson said quietly. "Not just the building, but what we've built inside it. Our life. Our love. Our impossible future." He turned to face her, and Frances saw he was nervous in a way she hadn't seen since that first night they reunited. "I know we said we were taking things slow," Wilson continued. "And we have. 8 months of building a foundation, of making sure we were choosing each other for the right reasons. And Frances, I've never been more sure of anything." He pulled a small box from his pocket, and Frances's breath caught. "This was Caroline's ring," Wilson said, opening the box to reveal a simple, elegant band with a single diamond. "I've been carrying it for 3 months, waiting for the right moment. But I realize there's no such thing as a perfect moment. There's just us choosing each other every day." He got down on one knee, and Frances felt tears streaming down her face. "Frances Mitchell, you saw me when I was invisible. You loved me when I thought I couldn't be loved again. You challenged me to be better, to do better, to remember why any of this matters. You're my partner, my home, my impossible dream come true." Wilson's voice cracked with emotion. "Will you marry me? Will you choose impossible with me? Will you build a life where we're just Wilson and Frances, facing whatever comes together?" Frances looked at the man kneeling before her. Not the billionaire, not the widower, just Wilson. The man who made soup from memory and painted hope, and saw her exactly as she was. She thought about the coffee shop, the note, the 3 days that changed everything. She thought about the fights and the fears and the choice to be brave. She thought about her mama, who'd worked 4 jobs and still dreamed. About Caroline, who'd painted beauty and believed in love. About Shanice, who'd fought for her own impossible love. About all the women who'd chosen courage over comfort. And she made her choice. "Yes," Frances said, dropping to her knees in front of him so they were eye to eye. "Yes, I'll marry you. I'll choose impossible with you every single day. I'll build a life with you, not in your world or my world, but in our world. Yes, Wilson. 1,000 times yes." Wilson slipped the ring onto her finger, Caroline's ring, but also Frances's now, a blessing from the past and a promise for the future. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her while the studio, filled with paintings of hope and love and reaching through barriers toward light, seemed to glow around them. When they finally pulled apart, both laughing and crying, Frances looked at the ring on her finger. "Caroline had good taste," she said. "She did," Wilson agreed. "And I think she'd be happy. Happy that the ring is being worn by someone who loves as bravely as she did." "I'm terrified," Frances admitted. "Of planning a wedding, of being Wilson Chambers' wife, of all the ways this could still go wrong." "Me too," Wilson said. "But we'll be terrified together. And we'll keep choosing each other, even when, especially when, it's hard." "Deal," Frances said, kissing him again. They were married 6 months later, in a small ceremony at the brownstone. Just 30 people, Francis's closest friends, Wilson's small inner circle, Eddie from Rosie's diner, Patricia the journalist who'd told their story, and a few representatives from the nonprofit where Francis now worked full-time while finishing her master's degree. Francis wore a simple ivory dress she'd found at a vintage shop. Wilson wore the same navy suit he'd worn on their first real date. There were no photographers, no press release, no spectacle. Just two people promising to see each other, to choose each other, to build an impossible love one day at a time. Eddie walked Francis down the aisle, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Your mama would be so proud," he whispered. "So damn proud." When Francis reached Wilson at the makeshift altar in front of Caroline's paintings, she saw that he was crying too. "Hi," she whispered. "Hi," he replied. "Ready for impossible?" "Every day," Francis promised. The ceremony was brief. They'd written their own vows, and Francis went first. "Wilson, you taught me that being seen isn't something to fear, it's something to cherish. You showed me that love isn't about being perfect, it's about being real. I promise to choose you every day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. I promise to build a life with you that honors both our pasts and creates a future we can't yet imagine. I promise to paint with you and dance with you and see you, always, as the man who loved me brave." Wilson's vows were equally simple. "Francis, you walked into my life disguised as a cup of coffee and changed everything. You reminded me that wealth means nothing without connection, that success means nothing without purpose, and that life is too short to spend it invisible. I promise to see you, to honor you, to challenge you and be challenged by you. I promise to build a world where we're just Wilson and Francis, facing whatever comes with courage and hope and terrible abstract art." The small crowd laughed through their tears. When the officiant pronounced them married, Wilson and Francis kissed while their friends and family cheered. And in that moment, surrounded by love and light and Caroline's blessing painted on canvas, Frances Mitchell, now Frances Chambers, though she'd keep using Mitchell professionally, felt something she'd spent most of her life not allowing herself to feel. She felt worthy. Worthy of love. Worthy of happiness. Worthy of being seen. The reception was in the garden behind the brownstone. String lights and good food and music from Wilson's jazz collection. Francis danced with Eddie, with Shanice, with the women from the nonprofit. Wilson danced with his assistant, with Patricia, with Shanice's boyfriend Deshawn. And then they danced together, just the two of them, while everyone watched. "We did it," Francis murmured against Wilson's chest. "We actually did it. Did you doubt we would?" "Every single day," Francis admitted. "And I probably will tomorrow too. But I'll keep choosing this anyway." "Good," Wilson said. "Because I'm going to keep choosing you. Every day. For the rest of our lives." As the evening deepened into night, Francis looked around at the celebration. Humble by billionaire standards, but rich with genuine love and connection. She thought about the woman who'd poured coffee 8 months ago, invisible and exhausted and convinced she'd spend her life alone. That woman would never have believed this moment was possible. But Francis had learned something crucial. Impossible was just another word for hasn't happened yet. Later, after the guests had left and the caterers had cleaned up, Wilson and Francis sat on the back steps of the brownstone, watching the stars emerge over Brooklyn. "What are you thinking about?" Wilson asked. "That note," Francis said. "The one I slipped under your coffee cup. If I'd known everything that would happen, I don't know if I would have been brave enough to write it." "I'm glad you didn't know," Wilson said. "I'm glad neither of us knew. Because if we'd known how hard it would be, we might not have tried. And that would have been the real tragedy." Francis leaned her head on his shoulder. "I love you, Mr. Chambers. I love you too, Mrs. Chambers Mitchell." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars, feeling the future stretch out before them full of possibility and challenge, and the impossible love they'd chosen. Somewhere in the brownstone, Caroline's paintings glowed with memories of love that had been and blessings for love yet to come. Somewhere in Queens, Rosie's diner served coffee to tired workers starting early shifts, each cup poured by someone who might feel invisible, but wasn't. Not really, not when there were people in the world willing to see them. Somewhere in the city, other impossible loves were beginning, other notes were being written, other people were choosing courage over comfort. And in a garden in Brooklyn Heights, two people who'd found each other over black coffee and a moment of kindness held hands and watched the stars and knew, truly knew, that love, in all its messy, complicated, impossible glory, was worth every risk. "What happens now?" Francis asked, echoing the question she'd posed months ago. Wilson smiled. "Now, Now we live happily ever after. But a real happily ever after, Francis clarified. With arguments and challenges and hard days. The realest kind, Wilson agreed. The kind where we choose each other, every morning, no matter what. The kind Caroline would have wanted for me. The kind your mama would have wanted for you. I can live with that, Francis said. Good, Wilson replied. Because I'm planning on at least 60 more years of this impossible love. Only 60? Francis teased. Fine. Forever. I'm planning on forever. Francis turned to kiss her husband. Still strange to think of him that way, but wonderful too. And in that kiss was everything. The fear and the hope. The past and the future. The choice to be seen, to be loved, to be brave. When they finally went inside, Wilson carried Francis over the threshold of their home while she laughed and protested and loved him all the more for the gesture. And as the lights in the brownstone glowed warm against the Brooklyn night, two people who'd been invisible in different ways settled into the life they'd built together. A life where love conquered not through magic or ease, but through choice. Daily, difficult, beautiful choice. The kind of love that wasn't impossible after all. Just improbable, hard-won, and absolutely undeniably real.